Hello everyone. This is What If Luffy Was Raised by Whitebeard. Please like and subscribe and enjoy the video. Thatch had a plan. True, it wasn't one of his best or most well thought out plans, nothing could top the Egg Day plan, but still, it was a plan. And every good plan needs proper planning to come together perfectly. He was writing a list of materials he was going to need to pull it off. While he was thinking about the finer details, Ace had come in looking for Luffy and Sabo. The Moby Dick was a massive ship and gave the boys plenty of room to entertain themselves, so Luffy had decided to play hide and seek. Ace, failing at rock paper scissors, ended up being it and had to count to 50 while his brothers ran off and hid. Now that he was done counting, he had wandered off to look for his brothers. Walking into the galley where he was sure Luffy would hide, he spotted Thatch leaning over on the counter, humming and writing things down. "Whatcha doin'?" Ace asked, startling the man into dropping his pencil and covering the list with his hands. When Thatch realized that it was just one of the kids, he sighed in relief. He was afraid Marco would discover his secret plans. Still, he had to be cautious. Ace could blab to Luffy, Luffy would definitely blab to Marco, and then his whole plan would be ruined. "Hey, brat. What are MUM doing?" he countered, subtly trying to cover up his list a bit more. Ace noticed and became curious. "Looking for Luffy and Sabo. We're playing hide and go seek," he answered innocently, leaning over a bit to try and see what was on the now completely covered list. "Speaking of hiding and seeking, what are you hiding?" Ace asked, smirking a little. Thatch eyed the kid suspiciously. He knew the kid was getting on Marco's mother hen list, so he was wary to talk about his plan with the brat. Then again. "Promise not to tell anyone, not even Marco?" Thatch asked seriously and Ace nodded his head. Thatch looked at him a little longer before picking him up and plopping him down on the counter beside him. He would be useful. "Have you ever pulled a prank before?" Thatch asked with a smirk. When Ace shook his head no, Thatch laughed loudly and ruffled the kid's hair. "Well then, it looks like I'll have to teach you little brother," he said with a wide grin. Ace quickly forgot about his game of hide and seek altogether as he learned about this strange and exciting thing called pranking from his older brother. Line break. Luffy was curled up in a ball starting to feel incredibly bored. His epic hiding spot must have been too good if it was taking Ace this long to find him, and Luffy wasn't one for patience. 5 minutes or so passed by and Luffy had all but given up on his hiding. If Ace was taking this long, Luffy knew he was going to have to reteach his brother how to play hide and seek. "What are you doing under there, Yoi?" Marco asked, lifting up the blanket that Luffy had been hiding under. "I'm playing hide and seek with Ace and Sabo. Ace is seeking and I was hiding in my amazing hiding spot, but Ace sucks at being it and hasn't found me yet," Luffy answered in disappointment, grabbing the blanket and wrapping himself in it. "I don't think your hiding spot would have worked anyways, Luffy," Marco replied with a chuckle. "What are you talking about? My hiding spot's the best." Luffy pouted. Marco simply laughed. "I do wonder about that, Yoi." Luffy continued to pout at Marco, whose smile just grew. "I'm getting a bit hungry, how about you?" he asked, knowing that it would definitely distract his brother since Luffy was always hungry. "You bet I am." Luffy shouted, grabbing Marco's hand and letting the man lead him to the galley for food. When they arrived, however, Marco saw Thatch with his head low, whispering something Ace as they both wore massive grins. Stopping Luffy before he could enter the room, Marco motioned for Luffy to be super quiet. Marco tried to listen in on the near-silent conversation to find out which division was about to be pranked, hoping against hope that his own and the second were safe. He could deal with helping another commander clean up Thatch's mess, but cleaning up his own division plus the other one that was without a commander would be annoying. "Marco, food." Luffy whined, pulling on his hand in annoyance. Marco just patted his head and listened closely to Thatch. Hearing that his own division wasn't on the chopping block, he bent down to Luffy's level to talk to the kid eye to eye. "Luffy, your big brothers are about to do something really crazy. I think it's probably better that we don't bother them for the time being. How about we go play somewhere else for a bit, Yoi?" Marco asked, making the kid pout but nod and follow Marco anyways. He wanted a snack, but he knew dinner would be soon. He could wait just a little bit more. Heading back towards Luffy's amazing hiding spot, Marco grabbed the blanket and threw it around the kid's shoulders. Luffy looked at him in confusion before he was pulled into Marco's lap to cuddle for a loved cuddling, no matter who it was that was giving the cuddles. He thrived off of physical affection, and being hugged was one of his favorite things in the world. Next to meat and his straw hat, of course. Sometimes, he would give hugs to everyone he came across just because he could. "Did you know that there are people who live in the sky, Yoi?" Marco asked. Luffy's eyes sparkled and he shook his head rapidly. Chuckling, he went on, "Well, there are people who live way up in the sky, on top of the clouds." It's very hard to get to them, but every once in a while when the sun hits the sky just right, you can see their shadows hanging over you." As Marco went on about these strange and miraculous people, Luffy was so absorbed that he didn't see Sabo walk by them looking for Ace. Line break. To say that Sabo was annoyed would be a drastic understatement. In reality, he felt like might just kill Ace. They had been playing a game of hide and seek, and Ace decided somewhere along the way that he wasn't going to look for them. Sabo had waited in his spot for what felt like hours, but was actually closer to 20 minutes for Ace to find him, but he never did. He came out of hiding to find Luffy had come to the same conclusion that Ace wasn't looking for them anymore and had curled up on Marco's lap to listen to a story. Sabo thought of joining them, but saw the way the two were deeply in their own world, with just the two of them. He felt it would be rude to interrupt them, so he left. Sabo continued to wander around the ship in hopes of finding Ace, so he could vent his frustration. And by vent his frustration, he meant beat the ever-loving crap out of the little bastard. Beating up Ace would definitely relieve his frustration. It always did. As he was muttering to himself about how stupid Ace was, he caught sight of the 8th Division commander, Namor. Namor was talking with others in his division when he spotted Sabo looking his way. He didn't know why the boy was watching him, but he figured it might be due to the way he looked. Being a fishman, he was used to be stared at, although usually it didn't happen too often at home. Beckoning Sabo over, he saw the kid blush in embarrassment at being caught staring, but he came over anyways. "IMH, have you seen Ace at all?" Sabo stuttered, unsure of what to say after being caught. Namor laughed good-naturedly. "I can't say that I have. Word on the ship is that Thatch is up to something big, though, so perhaps he too took cover," Namor suggested. He knew Thatch was going to do something at breakfast when the man was humming at the table. That was usually everyone's first sign to either duck and cover or find out what he had done before it caused more trouble. Sabo merely nodded, still staring at the fishmen. "Is it true that the fishmen have their own island?" Sabo blurted out. "I know Luffy says there is, but I was just wondering," he added, attempting to regain his dignity. "It's true, it's a beautiful place where many pirates stop before entering the New World," Namor stated matter-of-factly. He was very proud of his home and how it was under Pop's protection. "Wow. That's amazing. So there must be many pirates that the island has seen. How do they keep it so safe?" Sabo asked, his eyes turning towards Namor. Namor smiled, enjoying the curiosity of the little one. "The island is under Pop's protection. No one would dare go against him, so those who travel to the island know to be good or face his wrath." Namor laughed, prompting Sabo to join in his amusement. "You seem to like pirates, kid. I figured you'd want to be a marine being Garp's grandchild," Namor stated, looking at the kid as Sabo grimaced. "That old geezer's not my grandpa," Sabo exclaimed, slightly confusing Namor as it was not what he had heard, but he accepted it. "I like pirates because they're free," Sabo continued, his eyes looking sad and distant, as if remembering a misfortune of the past. Namor thought a child his age was too young to be inflicted with such sadness and felt the need to take it away from him. "And if you became a pirate that would make you free?" Namor asked him seriously. "Yes, sir. Pirates can do as they please with no one to hold them back. I just want to sail the seas and write about my adventures for the world to remember someday." Sabo smiled. His grin wasn't quite up to Luffy's standard in how big or bright it was, but it sure brought a light of its own to the ship. "MNN," Namor hummed, smiling at the kid. He knew that he was going to enjoy having this brat on board. Being on a ship full of cutthroats and brigands, even though they were the best and most loved ones around, being his family, he didn't often get the opportunity to engage in any semblance of intellectual conversation. But this remarkably intelligent child, he would definitely be getting that opportunity much more often. He felt like he knew that he would greatly enjoy this brat's presence on the ship. Line break. When dinner rolled around, Luffy was telling Sabo all about the people in the sky. Sabo listened because he knew Marco must have been the one to tell him this tale. Once he finished listening to Luffy, he saw that Ace and Thatch had finally entered the galley to eat their dinner, laughing their heads off of it, something they only seemed to know. Sabo, feeling his temper rise, waited for Ace to sit down beside Luffy before standing up and punching the back of his head. "Ouch. What the hell, Sabo?" Ace asked, turning around fast in his seat. "That's for ditching our game and making me wait for an hour." He growled. It was actually 20 minutes. Ace's eyes widened, remembering that he was supposed to be it. "Oh. Yeah. Sorry about that," he stated nonchalantly, turning to his food. Sabo just closed his eyes, twitching in irritation. "You really suck at games, Ace," Luffy added offhandedly, stealing a piece of Sabo's dinner. "Well, we'll have to work on that now, won't we?" Thatch said, putting an arm around Ace's shoulders and giving the kid a grin. Ace laughed at the idea before his head dropped right into his mashed potatoes. The room fell silent for a moment, not quite sure what was going on. Sabo, having seen this before, smiled at the opportunity to get his revenge. "Nah, Aizu, would you happen to have anything I could draw with?" Sabo asked the crossdresser overly sweetly. Aizu raised a brow at the kid but pulled out one of his liquid eyeliner pencils he was going to discard after dinner due to it drying up quickly. Passing the black makeup to Sabo, he watched as the kid walked over to Ace, lifted his head up and began to connect the freckles on his cheeks. Everyone couldn't stop themselves from laughing hysterically at the scene. "Does this happen often, Yoi?" Marco asked, trying and failing to suppress a grin. "Ace is narcoleptic, so yeah, this does happen pretty often," Sabo smiled, letting his brother sleep in his dinner with black makeup covering his cheeks. "I'd wake him up soon though," Thatch cautioned. Sabo tilted his head in confusion. "Luffy doesn't care what's in the way when food is involved. Ace won't get anything if he doesn't get up before Luffy's finished," he said with a shrug, making Sabo sigh before hitting Ace in the back of the head. Ace jumped up in surprise and looked around before picking up his fork and continuing eating. "Oh. I don't know if you've realized this yet, but Ace's appetite is probably just as big as Luffy's," Sabo said, smirking as Thatch paled. The little blonde couldn't help but smile as his revenge had been carried out on both Ace and Thatch. What a good day it had been. Luffy was sitting on the figurehead of the Moby Dick staring at the water like usual. He enjoyed watching the ripples from the ship on the surface and the sound of the waves hitting the ship's side. Sometimes he just closed his eyes and listened for hours on end, enjoying the freedom of the water. The crew was heading back towards a winter island, making their way ever closer to Subodi. Pops had decided that the boys were now accustomed to the Grand Line's weather changes and Dr. Myra was watching over them to ensure no sickness happened, so it was back to the new world they were heading. The crew wasn't actually planning on stopping off at the winter island, but with some whining and complaining and begging to Marco, who in turn had to tell the navigation division the orders, the winter island was now part of the plan. Thatch smiled widely at the thought of spending Christmas in the snow. For Thatch, it wasn't the day or whatever meaning it came with that made him love the holiday, it was the meaning of family and being close together that made him smile. The nurses once told Luffy that Valentine's Day was to show your love for someone, Christmas was pretty much the same deal. This time was a chance to show his family how much he cared and appreciated them all for who they are. The crew as a whole was way too big to just get everyone a present, so they drew names from a hat and did their best to get that person a gift. Luffy had experienced Christmas many times before and loved the whole season, or maybe it was just the fact he got presents. Ace and Sabo, however, had never gone through this and had no clue as to why the ship was now being decorated and Luffy was wearing a red fuzzy hat on his head instead of his normal one. Ace, having lived with bandits his whole life, never celebrated anything other than eating a good meal and being happy for that. Dayton did throw him something different for his birthday every once in a while, usually it was a new blanket or letting him have the first bite of dinner, but nothing too special. Luffy's name was never entered in the drawing, since everyone wanted to buy him gifts. Seeing the kid happy made the crew smile, and now Ace and Sabo were part of the present exchanges, whether they liked it or not. The crew had known Christmas was coming for quite some time, especially since the lively 4th Division began to spread their versions of Christmas cheer. Sabo had been to Christmas parties with his original noble family a few times before and absolutely hated them. He hated the stuffiness and the comparing of who got the most expensive present there. He wasn't looking forward to Christmas even though he was away from those people, the memory of it still left a bad taste to him. A few weeks before, Thatch was walking along the streets of an island and saw in the window a bright orange hat. It was just sitting there begging to be worn, but Thatch would never wear a hat that would conflict with his amazing hairstyle after all. He, however, could think of one little brat that was missing a hat and that was sad in his eyes. Luffy wore his ever-loving straw hat and Sabo had his large top hat. Ace was the only brat without something covering his dark wavy hair. Thatch couldn't let that go for very long, so he bought the hat as a present for Christmas. Marco had been walking with Aizu and Vista checking out shops around the town in hopes to find something for the brats. Marco was just about to give up and buy the kid some new clothes or something like that when Vista pointed out a small shop close by. The shop had plenty of smaller weapons in it, training weapons to teach a child, but still weapons all the same. Luffy had been training with the commanders to get better at protecting himself and work on his aiming, which he still rather sucked at. Vista pointed out some wooden swords that the kid would probably like. He knew Luffy was working with a metal pipe, but the swords could help teach him better balance. Aizu saw a slingshot that he believed he could use to help train the kid to have a better aim, and a grin began to form on the man's face at the thought of Luffy and him training more together. Marco saw something a little less important. In the back of the shop was a collection of bronze statues. Some of the statues were big and some were small, but they all had that old feel to them that he knew the kid would love. The men bought what they saw for the children in the shop and left with lighter hearts and an excitement for Christmas coming up. Along the way they had picked up things for Sabo and Ace, as well as buying their chosen person their present for the year. All in all, it was a pretty productive day. Luffy, being the ever-hungry child he was sent as far away from the kitchen as possible while the cooks worked very hard on a feast for the special day. Because he wasn't allowed near the galley but could smell the delicious turkeys cooking everywhere on the ship, Luffy decided to go to his special spot on the figurehead to try and avoid the amazing smells. "What ya doin'?" Sabo said, climbing over the railing to sit with Luffy. Sabo wasn't sure the kid should be out here, but figured if Marco hadn't stopped him he was relatively safe. Marco wouldn't let Luffy do anything dangerous while he was around. "Just watching." Luffy replied while laid on his stomach, his hands resting under his chin and his eyes turned up towards the ocean in front of him. Sabo sat down beside him and tried to see whatever Luffy was watching but found nothing. "All I see is the ocean," he trailed off, hoping Luffy would explain whatever he was looking at. Man, isn't it amazing?" he said with his grin. Sabo shook his head and stuffed the straw hat onto Luffy's dark hair. "What's going on with the crew today?" he asked, finally not understanding the chaos that was happening around him. Luffy just smiled wider, sitting up. "It's Christmas Eve," Luffy said with a large cheer. "And so what?" Ace came climbing over the railing towards the kids, looking annoyed to find them somewhere he wasn't. "Christmas is amazing. Santa comes and gives presents." He threw his hands in the air in exaggeration. "Santa? Isn't Santa for kids?" Sabo asked Luffy with an incredulous look. "Santa is for everyone," Luffy said to him in return, giving Sabo a weird look. Ace just looked between the two, confused. "Who the heck is Santa?" he asked, making the kids laugh. "Santa is a mystery man who bring presents," Luffy explained seriously to Ace, who in turn looked towards Sabo for a better explanation, only for the kid to shrug his shoulders. "Pretty much," he said with a smile. "Well, why does he do that?" Ace, now more confused than before, asked them. Luffy laughed. "It's a mystery." And with that the kid got up and ran off somewhere else. Sabo had never really learned about Santa since his family just bought stuff and said it was from them. Either Santa didn't care for the nobles of the world, in which he didn't blame the guy, or he didn't exist. Ace, getting the hint that Luffy was off in search of either food or entertainment, left the figurehead in search of what the heck Santa was and why Luffy was excited to see him. Sabo sighed as he watched Ace wander off on his own and decided to go to the library to read up on things his own way. The three may be brothers now, but they were very different in many ways from one another. Ace wandered until he found Marco leaving Whitebeard's room with a satisfied smile on his face. "Yo." Ace said, waving towards the man who smiled at the kid. "Where's your brother's Yui?" he asked, looking down at the child who usually went everywhere the other two went. Marco had just dropped off all of his finished paperwork to the old man and felt free now that he could spend Christmas without the knowledge he would be working the rest of the next day. "I think Luffy has gone off to beg at the kitchens, and Sabo, well done. Oh, it's not like I have to be with them all the time," Ace said, crossing his arms and pouting a bit. Marco smiled wider at him. "And what about you, Yui? Where are you heading?" He bent down to look at Ace better. "I'm looking into who this Santa guy is and why he brings stupid presents to Luffy. He sounds suspicious to me and Luffy's too innocent to know anything, so I have to protect him," Ace said, nodding his head and closing his eyes in determination to protect Luffy from this weirdo. Marco laughed, and loudly. This was the first time anyone had said that to him, especially a child. "Why don't I tell you a story about this Santa guy to clear things up? Sound good, brat Yui?" Marco said, offering his hand out to Ace, who hesitantly took it and let Marco lead him to the library, where he found Sabo with a pile of books on one of the desks. "Now what are you doing, Yui?" Marco asked, looking at the pile in confusion. "I'm trying to find out why Luffy likes Christmas so much. I mean, I've heard of it before, even had times where I participated in it, but not really sure why it's so important," he said with a shrug, putting another book down, sighing. Marco looked at the kid softly, now getting what was going on. Luffy had probably mentioned Christmas and Santa to the boys, and they were interested. "Well, I can explain things, I guess." Marco started, waiting for Ace to pull up a chair beside Sabo to pay attention to Marco. "I'm not giving you a huge backstory, that's boring, and we're pirates, or at least I am, so I'll give you what I think Christmas time is about, Yui," Marco said. The boys nodded their head in understanding. Ace wasn't interested in a long story since he was pretty sure a narcoleptic fit was on its way sometime soon. "Christmas is about family gathering and having a good time. Once a year we all gather together to appreciate that we are a family, and even though we argue, have fights and drive each other up the walls, we are still brothers and sisters under this flag," Marco said, giving the kids an understanding of his Christmas and how he felt on the subject. "Then what's with the presents? Is it someone's birthday?" Ace asked, confused now about that part. "No, it's not any of our family's birthday, it's just a thing that's done on this day. A man named Santa Claus comes and gives presents for children who have been good that year, and if you were bad all you'll get is a lump of coal, Yui," he said, pointing his finger in the air as a warning to being bad. The look on the kids' faces almost made Marco laugh. They both looked terrified for some reason. "We haven't been the best this year. What if Santa doesn't come at all?" Ace stammered out, his eyes wide in worry. What can we do to make it up to Santa? We don't even know what he looks like. Sabo shouted in fear. Marco really had to hold back his laughter. Well, Santa is a big fat man who wears red and comes to give presents while the children are sleeping, so don't worry about seeing him, Yoi. What can you do to get back on his good list? Well, I know. Marco said. The kids looked up at him, excited to do anything. You can go and help out Thatch get the tables ready for the feast. That sounds like something Santa would be very happy to see you both do, Yoi. Marco felt proud of this scheme and getting the kids to do some extra little bit. Right, we'll go and get Luffy to help out. They said, jumping up, but Marco stopped them quickly. Luffy's been pretty good this year, so I think he's safe, Yoi. Why don't you let me handle him? The boys looked at each other and nodded their heads in understanding before running off towards the kitchen to see what they can do to help get back on the good list. Marco chuckled quietly while walking towards the main deck to see Luffy now dressed in a reindeer onesie he guessed the nurses had forced him into. You look rather cozy, kid. Marco said, kneeling down to look at Luffy fully. The onesie was exactly like a reindeer's body with brown fuzzy fabric, a small tail on the kid's behind, and a hood with antlers over his head. Luffy smiled brightly at his big brother and nodded his head, actually liking his clothing, but only wished it was red and not brown. Amen. Nurse Hana told me it would keep me warm, and she was right. He said while wrapping his arms around Marco's neck, allowing the man to pick the kid up. Since you're dressed like a reindeer, would you like to hear a story about a magical one, Yoi? He asked the kid and watched his eyes sparkle in wonder. Bringing Luffy over to a small part of the ship, they sat down Luffy on Marco's lap and he told Luffy all about Rudolph, the red-nosed reindeer who helped save Christmas. By the end, Luffy was determined to make a reindeer his friend one day. Marco just wished him luck and laughed. Once dinner rolled around, Thatch had made the most delicious meal the two younger boys had ever had before. Luffy had experienced this type of Christmas many times in his short life, so he was used to this. Ace and Sabo not so much. Thatch thanked Marco for getting the brats to help him out without any problems and congratulated him on the fantastic idea of using Santa to his advantage. Once dinner finished, Marco made the kids take a warm bath and let them play around for a bit longer before bed. The three were chasing each other around on the deck when Luffy stopped running and looked up at the sky. Whitebeard was sitting on his throne, watching his youngest sons play, and smiled at the littlest one. It's snowing. Luffy shouted as a snowflake landed on his nose and melted. The other kids stopped and looked on in wonder before Marco came out to check on them, seeing the snow. Alright brats, it's bedtime, Yoi. Pop stood up, also meaning that it really was time for bed. The boys groaned. But we're not tired, Marco. Sabo whined. Ace and Luffy nodded their heads in agreement and Marco was about to reply, but Pops cut in. If you don't go to sleep, Santa can't come. He stated, and all eyes widened at their father. They couldn't risk Santa missing them because they were awake, so they all said their good nights and headed off to their room for bed. I wonder just how long we will be able to use that for. Thatch said from beside Marco, who shook his head. This will probably be the only year for Sabo and Ace. They're too smart to continue to believe in Santa Claus. Luffy is another matter, for him who knows. Marco said, shaking his head at the kids. Well, shall we get their presents ready for the morning? Thatch asked, and all present nodded their heads, gathering up the brats' gifts. They would do a proper exchange in the morning for one another, but for the kids, they wanted them to wake up and see all the gifts ready for them. When morning came, the kids burst from their room towards a commander who directed them towards Pop's chair, where presents all piled around it. Ace's eyes widened in excitement. Never had anyone ever given him a wrapped present before. Sabo was just in as much shock as Ace, looking at all the presents, and this time there wasn't anyone sticking their noses up or complaining. It was perfect. Luffy was impatient and jumped towards the pile, ready to open ones with his name on them. Hold up, kid. Thatch said, grabbing Luffy around the middle before he could tear through everything. Why don't we let your brothers open a present first? He said, smiling down to Luffy, and was happy to get a nod in return. Luffy sat down in front of the presents while the two boys moved closer to see which ones were for them. The whole crew came to surround the kids, excited to see the unwrapping and the gifts that they would get. Ace pulled a large square present from the pile and opened it carefully, not to damage the wrapping paper. Once he finished, he opened the lid on a box and found a bright orange cowboy hat with a chain of a sad face and a grinning face on it. Ace smiled widely towards the hat before putting it on his head in delight. Wow, Ace. Santa brought you a hat. Luffy said excitedly. Ace blushed and nodded his head, happy to have a gift of his own. Thatch's grin couldn't have been wider. He was so happy the kid liked the hat and that he had stumbled upon that shop. Sabo opened his present, but unlike Ace, he rushed to get the paper off of the gift. When he opened it up, he saw a leather-bound book and a pen with an ink beside it. Sabo smiled softly, looking at the gift when Harita sat down beside him. It's a journal so you can keep track of your experiences, both good and bad, so no memory is left forgotten. She said, and Sabo nodded, loving his gift so much. Luffy knew that it was his turn and he opened up a gift that was long and like Sabo wasted no time unwrapping the paper. When he opened the box he saw a long wooden training sword and his eyes lit up in excitement. "Looks like Santa would like you to become the greatest swordsman around," Vista said while Marco rolled his eyes like that would ever happen. Ace, realizing it was his turn again, opened up another present to find clothing and he was grateful he didn't really have much good clothing, so anything was wonderful to him. Sabo opened up to find maps and books about navigation and how to learn it. Luffy opened his presents to find the slingshot, making Aizu counter Vista's words. With how Luffy would become the true king of snipers in this world, Marco just shook his head at the two. The boys continued to open presents, getting a lot of gifts from Santa, and Luffy loved his bronze statue of a knight. He swore to treasure it, always making Marco smile widely, knowing that Luffy would love that. Once they had all finished unwrapping their gifts and showing them off, Marco and Thatch helped the kids put their gifts away and turned them towards the galley for brunch. Whitebeard smiled at his youngest children, happy to see them so happy. He knew from their looks that the elder boys may not have ever experienced this before and hoped there would be more things in this coming new year for them to learn and grow from. After all, they were his children now and forever. This Christmas may have been a bit more lively for them all, but all in all it was the best one around in Marco's eyes since he got to see Luffy smile and Ace and Sabo experience what being a part of a family was supposed to feel like. Everyone was happy and the crew never looked brighter. Ace knew it was coming, the day he hated most in this world. Right after Christmas there was now a bright feeling in his heart that he had never truly felt before. He was so into that new feeling he forgot the day that comes quickly after it, his birthday. New Year's Day was a day when everyone celebrated the beginning of a new year, but for him it was a reminder that he was even allowed to be born into this world, and he hated it. Unfortunately for Ace, Sabo mentioned this little fact to the loud and excitable Luffy, and Luffy mentioned it to every passing person on the large ship. The one day he would like to forever forget was now about to be celebrated and he could do nothing to stop it. "So I hear it's your birthday soon," Thatch said, leaning against a wall while Ace just closed his eyes and tried to keep calm. "And what of it? It's just another year, no big deal," he snarled to the man who looked shocked at this. "Ace, this is a huge deal. You're turning 11 years old. Soon you'll be a teenager. We need to celebrate your youth while we have the chance," Thatch said, dramatically ignoring the kid's tone of voice for now. Ace rolled his eyes at the man in annoyance. "Really, it's not a big deal. I'd rather no one actually remembered my birthday and just had a normal day," he said, shrugging his shoulders and walking away. Thatch wasn't going to allow this to go on, a kid not wanting to celebrate his own birthday. What was wrong with that child? Thatch knew he would have to make it the best birthday yet. Before Thatch could actually know how to celebrate the brat's birthday, he would have to do some digging for information. Just why did the kid hate his birthday so much? Luffy loves his birthday, heck, even he loved his birthday but will refuse to tell you his age. He knew that Luffy had no other information or he would have already given it up, but Sabo, he just might be what Thatch was looking for. Unfortunately for Thatch, Sabo seemed to realize that the crew might want information and made himself as hard to catch as possible, even using Luffy to escape from the many siblings on the ship. Thatch had been chasing the kid around for about a day when he finally cornered him. "You can't outrun me forever, kid, I just want to talk," he said, putting his hands up as a surrendering, peacemaking, friendly way in hopes the kid wouldn't pull some sort of ninja stuff and disappear. "I'll never say anything," Sabo said defiantly, making Thatch inwardly groan. "I just want to know why Ace hates his birthday. It's not like I'm asking you to spill his life story." But Sabo refused to let up. If he has a reason, then it's his reason to tell. He glared at the commander. Sabo knew Ace's reason, even Luffy sort of knew Ace's reason, but it was Ace's job to tell others, not his or Luffy's. "We just want to do a small celebration, nothing big. I just want to know why he won't even let us do that," Thatch said softly, and Sabo did feel bad about not telling them, but still. "I'm sorry, but it's not my place to tell you," Sabo sighed, looking down, now feeling guilty. "If I ask Ace, would he tell me the reason?" Thatch questioned the kid, who shook his head. "Most likely not. He hates his birthday almost as much as his." Sabo's eyes widened and he placed his hands over his mouth and looked up at Thatch, shocked. Thatch raised his brow at the kid, hoping to get him to go on, but Sabo took a step back and bolted away quickly. "Well, that was interesting, almost as much as what dare I ask." He was happy to have gotten a clue even if it was unintended. Later that day, Thatch caught up to Luffy, who looked up at him with bright sparkling eyes. "So are we gonna have a party for Ace?" Luffy asked excitedly. "I don't think so, kid, Ace doesn't want us to," Thatch said with disappointment, and Luffy looked devastated. "But it's his birthday. Birthdays are fun," Luffy pleaded to the man who understood the wonderful thing called birthdays. "Ace doesn't seem to like his birthday, so it might be a good idea not to do anything, Lou." Luffy's eyes widened and a spark of understanding shot through those dark brown eyes. Maybe it's because of and Luffy let go of Thatch's hand and took off again, making the brunette very curious as to what was going on that he didn't know about. Luffy found Sabo and Ace in their room playing a game of cards just as he burst through the door. "Do you not like your birthday because of your dad?" Luffy blurted out, making Sabo's mouth drop and Ace scowl. "And what do you know of anything?" Ace stood up and pounded the kid on the top of his head, making a bump grow. "Because I know you don't like him, but that doesn't mean you don't need to like your birthday," Luffy exclaimed while nursing the bump growing as Ace pounded him once more, causing another to grow on top. "It doesn't matter," he shouted and stomped out of the room. Sabo sighed and looked at the kid who now had a tear in his eye and his hand on his sore head. "You know just what to say to piss people off, you know that, right?" Sabo sighed a little more and knelt down to the kid who had now turned his head to the side in confusion. "What do you mean?" he whined, and Sabo patted his back a bit before helping him back on his feet. "Let's go talk with Ace, K." Sabo smiled and took Luffy's hand, hoping to find the hothead before any more trouble could be done. The boys, hand in hand, wandered the ship looking for Ace, while Thatch retreated to the kitchen, deciding to work on lunch rather than mope about not being able to celebrate a birthday. It was during this time that Ace walked into the kitchen and pulled a stool up towards the counter to sit on. Thatch watched the kid from the corner of his eyes, curious as to why the kid decided to come visit him after all the questioning he had done. "Nah," he said. Thatch put down the knife he was using to pay attention to the kid, giving him permission to continue on. "Do you think it was good that I was born?" Ace asked quietly, looking at the floor away from Thatch, who frowned at the question. "No, I don't," he said softly. Ace closed his eyes in acceptance. "I think it was better than good. I think it is the most wonderful thing." Ace looked up at the man quickly. "But you just said he was cut off by a hand on his shoulder." Thatch smiled kindly at the kid. "You're here and that makes me and so many people happy. By you being born, Luffy and Sabo have a friend to play with, fight with and love dearly. By you being here, I have a little brother now to take care of and teach until he's grown. By you being here, Luffy was able to meet Sabo and he was able to meet you. I don't think it was good that you were born, I think it was essential that you were born, Ace. You bring a new type of happiness to this ship, to this family, and I can't even remember what it was like before you and Sabo, Ace." Thatch said to the kid, whose eyes had widened and were starting to sting with emotions he refused to show. Is that why you want to celebrate my birthday?" he said softly, his voice shaky and his throat tight. "I like to remind everyone on this ship that this is one more year they have lived being a family. You're a part of the family now, Ace. Each year I want to now remind you that you're very loved by us, that's all," he said, and Ace bit his lip, really fighting hard now. "It's alright, kid, we don't need to celebrate, just know that we do care for you," he said softly, pulling Ace in for one of his big hugs, and Ace responded for the first time ever, taking deep breaths to calm himself down. He pulled away and looked at Thatch. "Maybe we can do something super small," he said, and Thatch smiled a bit wider. "Just with us?" And Ace nodded. Thatch knew that it was a start, that Ace was opening his heart up to him, but wasn't completely ready to open to the whole crew yet. "Just you, Luffy, Sabo and I?" Ace nodded again. "Alright, we'll celebrate tonight in my room after dinner, sound okay?" Ace looked confused. "But my birthday isn't for another 3 days," he said, but Thatch shook his head. "You don't like that day, right? Until the day you do like your birthday, we'll celebrate on a different day." Thatch crossed his arms and nodded, satisfied at his logic, making Ace laugh at him. "Alright, sounds fair," he said before waving at his friend and running off to relay the information to Luffy and Sabo. "Looks like I have a cake to make tonight," he said with a smile, hoping Ace liked chocolate. After dinner, Sabo, Luffy and Ace all excused themselves from a very curious Marco and followed Thatch to his room, where he had set up the chocolate strawberry cake for Ace and a few board games on the desk. Ace saw the cake and he froze. He had never had a cake before. "Look, Ace, a cake." Luffy went running right away towards it, but Thatch caught him and shook his head. "It's Ace's birthday, he gets the first slice and there's plenty for everyone," he said, and Luffy turned towards Ace, who was still shell-shocked, and he shook his head at the kid. "Luffy may be patient because it's your birthday, but even he won't last long, so come get a slice, brat," he said to Ace, who took a step forward slowly. Towards the cake. "Shanks coming. Shanks coming. Shanks coming," Luffy shouted while running around the Moby Dick in pure happiness. Marco felt a head itch coming on, but smiled anyways for the kid. "Yes, I'm afraid he is, Yui," he sighed while Luffy cheered some more at this information. "Who's Shanks?" Ace asked Marco, who looked down at the kid, a shadow covering his face. "The most annoying man you will ever meet in your life," he said seriously. Ace took a step back and gave Marco a weird look. "How so?" Sabo asked from beside Ace, looking at Marco weirdly. "Just picture a grown, drunk Luffy with red hair and you have the man known as Shanks, Yui," he sighed while Ace and Sabo's eyes widened in horror. "Then why is he coming here?" Sabo exclaimed, not that excited to see that version on his little brother. Because he is one of the four emperors just like Pops, he's also Luffy's idol unfortunately. Thatch said, joining the conversation, and Marco sighed once again. Of all the people Luffy could look up to, Shanks would be it. Seriously, why didn't he ever look up to me that way? I've known him longer, Yoy. Marco said, annoyed at the man already. Thatch laughed and patted Marco on the shoulder. You're his brother and Shanks is someone outside of the family, someone he can watch from a distance. He does look up to you, Marco, he just does it in a different way, that's all. Marco gave Thatch a grateful smile, while the two boys looked confused at the grown men. How long till he gets here then? Sabo asked, still afraid of the description of the man, but excited to meet another that had the same title as his Pops. Soon enough, Yoy. Marco said before he headed off to chase after the hyper child. Luffy was excited, he hadn't seen Shanks in almost 2 years. He couldn't wait to show him how much he had grown since he first got his hat. He had worked really hard on controlling his Gomu powers, but his aim was still a struggle for him. He really was trying, it was just so hard. He was taught to imagine the exact spot he wanted to hit, and he did, but he always missed it a little bit. He wanted to be stronger first then aim, but Aizu kept scolding him, saying strength was nothing if he couldn't hit his target. He didn't understand, so he just did what he always did and hoped for the best. Now Luffy, what's Shanks really like? Ace asked Luffy, who brightened at the thought of the man. He's so cool. He's super strong and can do anything. He likes to party a lot and I got my Gomu Gomu no Mi from him. Luffy's grin was almost splitting his face. He's really strong? Sabo asked him and Luffy nodded his head quickly. Amen. Thatch said that he was as strong as Pops. He shouted and Sabo covered his ears quickly from the noise. Calm down, Luffy, you're hurting my ears. He exclaimed at the kid in annoyance, who only laughed. Shishishi, sorry. He smiled, not sounding sorry at all, before running off to see the old man. Pops. When is Shanks coming? He shouted up at the old man, who just laughed at the kid, knowing he would be this excited. Soon enough, my son, we are planning on meeting on the closest island. He smiled down at the kid, who was now climbing his leg to sit on his lap. He's not coming here, Luffy began to pout. No, it's safer to meet at an island under my protection. Think of it this way, little one, you get to have an adventure and see Shanks all in the same day. He knew that would catch the kid's attention. Adventure and Shanks. He trailed off, his eyes shining brightly at the thought only a plateful of meat could make this any better. How much longer? He asked his father, and Luffy's eyes were wide and bright, making the old man's heart swell for the boy. We will be there in an hour. If you go to the figurehead you can see the island from here. He pointed his large hand in the distance they were traveling. Luffy jumped off his lap and waved goodbye before rushing to see the island from the spot. Lying on his stomach, Luffy stared at the approaching island, a wide grin on his face, and his hands tugging on the sides of the hat in anticipation. Shanks, he said to himself, closing his eyes, remembering the time he spent with the man. Marco was watching from his spot above at the kid, a twinge of jealousy at the rival emperor for having hold of the kid's heart like this. He couldn't help, however, to smile softly at the way Luffy was acting. He knew Luffy loved them all, but Shanks was on a level higher than them, lower than Pops, but more than Marco and Thatch. He shook his head to clear out the dark thoughts of being less loved than red-haired Shanks and tried to feel the excitement the kid was letting off. Everything was going to be alright and Luffy would have some fun. When they were close enough to the island, Luffy spotted the red force anchored at the docks and practically vibrated at the thought of seeing Shanks again. Ace and Sabo were a little shaken around how Luffy was reacting to the man, so they watched him closely. When the large ship anchored at the docks, many people were there to greet the crew, but Luffy went running straight off and towards a man with bright red hair, jumping in the air and hugging the man around the middle. Luffy? He laughed out loudly, making Luffy just hug him tighter. Shanks, I missed you. He said, putting his face into the man's shirt, hiding the tears of happiness he felt coming. I missed you too, kid. You're taking care of my hat, right? He said, patting the kid on the head, the straw hat dangling around his neck. Amen. He said, letting Shanks go and pulling the hat onto his head tightly. I can't give it back to you yet though. He said seriously, making Shanks laugh once again. Dahahaha. Of course you can't. You're not a pirate yet. Dahahaha. Luffy felt his eye twitching. I saw him a pirate. I'm just a mini one. Luffy stomped his foot onto Shanks' foot in annoyance, and the man grabbed his foot in pain. A brat is still a brat. He said, nursing his sore foot now, and smiled when he saw Marco standing behind Luffy, his hand on his hip and a look of annoyance on his lazy face. Marco, it's been a while. Do you want dot? He was cut off rather sharply by Marco, who glared at the emperor. Never yoy. He said, and Shanks laughed. Just checking, Luffy, how about we go get some lunch? It's been a long time, I bet you have some good stories to tell me. Luffy nodded his head and took Shanks' hand, letting the man lead him away from the crew. He waved goodbye to Marco quickly, then disappeared into the crowd of people with Shanks. Do you want us to follow them, Marco? Ace asked the blonde, never taking his eyes off of the way Luffy went. Nah, let them be. Shanks a weird man, but he does care about Luffy. He'll protect him from anything and everything. He said, his own eyes watching the direction they went to, memorizing it just in case something happened. If you say so. Ace said, but shrugged his shoulders in acceptance. So that's the man Luffy looks up to. Sabo said, well, thinking the description of the man was spot on, a drunken older Luffy with red hair. Yeah, Luffy got his hat from Shanks and made a promise with him to become a strong pirate someday, yoi. Marco said, leading the kids towards the town to walk around with them. Is that why he wants to be the pirate king? Ace said, looking at the ground as he said those words. Probably that's a part of the reason, but not all of it. Pops told Luffy old tales of the pirate king and Luffy really liked them. When the dream started, I'm not sure, but it's not like we've really done anything to stop this dream. If anything, I don't really mind having Luffy become the king. If he can prove he's strong enough for the title, then it would make me proud to call the next king my brother, yoi. Marco said with a thoughtful smile on his face, while Ace just stared at the man, really taking in his words. Luffy had a big dream, one that man other pirates have, and one that man other pirates have given up on. Ace wasn't sure what his dream was. He knew he wanted his name to be known, but how? Where did he need to start for that? Was that really a dream, or was it just a wish? Ace was so caught up in his own mind he walked into a stranger by accident. Watch where you're going, you stupid brat. A man who looked and smelled like a bandit sneered at Ace, making Marco stop in his tracks to glare at the man. I could say the same to you, yoi. He said back to the bandit calmly, but all could hear the ice in his voice, warning the stranger that fighting Marco was out of the question. The bandit sneered once more and walked off, complaining of needing a drink to drown them out. I smell trouble, Sabo said from beside Marco, who was helping Ace back on his feet when the brunette wrinkled his nose in response. You sure trouble is what you smell? I smell bandit, and man does he need a shower. Ace replied, waving his hand over his nose, making Sabo laugh and Marco smile. And brats, let's keep moving. And they headed off into town. Line break. So Ace and Sabo, they didn't really like me at first, but we're cool now. I got beaten up really bad though before we became friends, that hurt a lot. The guy had a spiked glove and he kept hitting me. I was sorta scared, then Marco and Thatch came in all cool like and fought off the bad guys. I was tired though, I mean I was hit really hard a lot. I wasn't scared that badly, I knew they would come for me. Luffy said to Shanks, who listened to the kid at the bar table. He took in the kid's words and felt concerned at the thought of him being hurt. Those kids just left you there? Why did you want to be their friend anyways, Lou? I mean, they abandoned you with someone you didn't know, you could have been killed, Shanks said, worry in his voice. I wouldn't have minded. This caught Shanks' attention. Being alone hurts, it hurt so much that I'd rather die than feel that pain. Luffy had stopped eating his meat and Shanks watched him closely. You're never alone, kid. He said seriously. I know, but not everyone has time to be with me, they all have bigger things to do, and I'm still small, there was no one to play with. He said, his meat now completely ignored. We're your friends now, right? He said, trying to get the kid away from the sadness, and it worked when Luffy brightened. More than that. We're brothers, and if anyone ever tries to hurt them, I'll beat them up. Shanks smiled at those words. He'd have to meet the two brats and make sure they understood Luffy was to be protected by them at all times. Oh, will you? He laughed out, making Luffy scowl and stand up on his bar stool. Of course. My punch is as strong a pistol. And he mock punched the air to emphasize his point, but Shanks took a bite of his food and smiled again. A pistol? Right, sure. He said offhandedly, causing Luffy's brow to twitch in annoyance. What's that supposed to mean? He shouted at the man. Shanks was about to mention something unimportant when the door to the bar opened suddenly with a bang on the wall, making Luffy turn his head to stare at the person who made the noise. Shanks' crew and Ben all stopped talking and watched the man curiously as he and a group of people came strolling into the room. Serve me and my men up the best steak in this joint. He said, and Shanks, who was sitting beside Luffy, became protective of the kid and turned his back towards Luffy, putting the kid behind him ever so slightly on the bar stool. Marco would never forgive him if Luffy was hurt in his presence. I'm sorry, sir, we've just run out of steak, the waitress said nervously, and the man raised his eyebrow. Then just what are these stupid pirates drinking, water? He asked, waving his hand towards the crew who were ready in case of anything but didn't move at all. They're drinking steak, but they just finished the very last of it. She said, trying to keep calm. Shanks waved his hand in the air, signaling the man over. Here, my men drank a lot, but I do have this one bottle left over, why don't you have it? He said in good nature that the man didn't seem to appreciate. He looked right at Shanks before lifting his hand up and shattering the bottle, sending the steak and glass everywhere. Luffy pushed himself back in surprise at the sudden amount of liquid spilling everywhere, and the waitress covered her mouth in shock. I'm a bandit worth 8 million berry, one bottle of steak isn't going to be enough, he said, while steak dripped off of Shanks' red hair. When Shanks looked up he had a look of worry on his face. Now the floor is all wet, sorry about that Ms. Waitress, do you have a mop? And Shanks got on the ground and stated to clean up the mess that was made. She came out of her shock and began to run and help Shanks clear up the mess in a panic. The bandit pulled out his sword still glaring at Shanks and sliced it along the bar counter, shattering everything, spilling drink everywhere. Luffy was shocked into silence and couldn't move. If there's no sake here then I'm wasting my time, later idiot pirates. And with that the bandits left howling in laughter at the mess they had created. Luffy was now shaking, holding onto his glass. He had never been so angry before. How dare they do that to Shanks? Shanks was on the floor covered in sake and a blank expression on his face. The waitress came over to help him, asking if he was okay. I'm alright, there's no problem," he said before looking up and laughing loudly, and the crew laughed just as loud. "He really got you, Captain," Yassip shouted, tears in his eyes from laughing so hard. "How shameful." Another shouted, laughing, and Shanks laughed loudly. Among them the only one not laughing was Luffy. "Why are you laughing?" he shouted at the crew, who all stopped to look at him in shock. Shanks said to the kid, who jumped to the ground and balled his hands into fist and shouted right at Shanks. "That was embarrassing, why didn't you fight back? So what if you were outnumbered? You should have fought like a real man. Aren't you supposed to be a pirate?" she shouted very quickly at Shanks, stomping his foot. Shanks brushed his hand through his hair and smiled softly at the kid. "I understand how you feel, but it's just spilled sake, nothing to get crazy about," he said, and gave a small grin at Luffy, who just made a face and began to walk away. "Screw that, I'm not going to be a weakling. I'm going to find Marco." Shanks sighed and shook his head at the kid, but let him go. Luffy would find Marco, and hopefully the pineapple head guy would explain it better to them kid. Luffy walked around town huffing out in anger. How dare they do that to Shanks, and how dare Shanks not fight back? Marco and Thatch would have fought back. He didn't know Shanks was that weak. He was wandering around when he saw the same bandit sitting outside laughing and talking loudly about how they beat up and humiliated a bunch of weak pirates. "Did you see their faces, such weaklings? Cowards the lot of them," another said and hit his knee in laughter. "I should have just killed them all right there and then," the leader said cockily to his group, and Luffy had about enough of them. If Shanks wouldn't stand up to them, he sure as hell would. "Shut up, you big buffoon," Luffy shouted at the bandits, who all stopped what they were doing and stared at the kid. "Hey, wasn't he with those coward pirates?" one of them asked suddenly, and the leader raised his eyebrow in interest. "I said stop making fun of Shanks." And Luffy ran at the man, trying to punch him, only to be knocked down by the bandit. "And what if I don't feel like it?" he said with a slimy smile. "Then I'll kick your ass," Luffy shouted, and the bandits laughed. "Such a foul-mouthed little boy, why don't I teach you a lesson?" And he punched Luffy in the stomach, making him land on the ground hard. One of the villagers knew that Luffy was a part of the Whitebeard crew and wanted to end this trouble without getting the captain involved, so the villager ran as fast as she could to the mayor, explaining what she had seen, and they moved quickly to defuse the situation before the pirate crew could cause trouble. By the time the mayor got there, the bandit was holding Luffy up by his cheek, looking at the kid in interest as it stretched out in his hands before he smiled. "Your body sure is interesting," he said with a laugh, looking Luffy over in interest. Shanks had cleaned himself up and was walking through town hoping to find Luffy and have a good talk when he ran into Marco, Thatch, and the two other kids, who all looked shocked not to see Luffy with any of them. "Where's Luffy, yoy?" Marco said, his voice tight with a worry now there. "We had a fight, I guess you can say. He told me he was going to find you," Shanks said, rubbing his head and smiling slightly. Marco sighed loudly. "And why did you fight?" Thatch said that was very unusual for Luffy to act like that. "Well, you see," he started, but then heard a bunch of commotion coming from a street over. Ben, who was behind Shanks, raised his brow, and the few members of Shanks' crew looked on in curiosity. "Shall we go see what's going on?" he said with a smile, and they all headed towards the noise, only to see Luffy being pushed around by a bandit. Blue flames started to lick Marco's shoulders, and his eyes narrowed. Thatch's hand moved towards his sword, but Shanks kept a calm face. "Stay here," he said, and started to walk forward. It looks like punches and kicks don't do any damage to you," the bandit said, very interested in the kid now. "Damn it, say you're sorry," Luffy shouted, trying to punch the bandit. Ace and Sabo were glaring at the man holding Luffy in the air, ready to jump in at any given second. "A rubber person, huh? I never imagined such a strange creature could exist," he said, looking at Luffy, who swore at the bandit and tried to punch him some more. The bandit swung his arm and Luffy went flying into the ground and bounced a bit before stopping. "Shit. I won't ever forgive you," Luffy shouted at the man, and Ace and Sabo nodded their heads in agreement. They would never forgive this man. "A rubber person, huh? I bet I could make a lot of money if I sold him at Sabaody." He placed his hand under his chin and thought Marco had enough. His flames were now starting to flare. How dare this man talk of selling his little brother, his little Luffy. Marco was going to kill the man for those words, but Ben held onto his shoulder. Leave it to Shanks. He said sternly, and Marco glared at the vice captain. Luffy had grabbed a stick from the ground and began to run at the man, hoping to hit him, only to be kicked in the head by the bandit and knocked down. Please, can I go kick his ass? A said, never taking his eyes off of Luffy. He was gritting his teeth so hard his jaw is hurting. Leave this to Shanks. Once again Ben said to the group. The bandit was now standing with his foot on Luffy's head and he was smiling down at the kid. All I wanted was to have a nice drink. Did I say something you didn't like? He asked Luffy, who was struggling to get back up. Yes, you did apologize. The bandit sneered at Luffy and pulled out his sword. Fine, I've decided I'm not going to sell you, I'm going to kill you instead right here and now. And he placed the sword at Luffy's throat. Marco had enough. Screw what Ben had said. He was stepping in. He took a step forward when Shanks caught Luffy's attention. Shanks walked up to the bandit, a smile on his face and his eyes overshadowed from the bright sun. I was wondering where you had gone to, Luffy. Didn't you say you were looking for Marco? He said, suddenly stopping in front of the bandit. Ben and the group walked past Marco, Thatch and the kids to stand behind Shanks supporting him. If it isn't the bandits from earlier, Luffy, didn't you say that your punch was as strong as a pistol? Shanks asked the kid, never taking his eyes off of the bandit. Luffy glared at Shanks, annoyed he would remind him of that. You shut up. He said from under the bandit's foot. Pirate, you're still here? Are you done cleaning already? He asked Shanks with a grin, while Marco and Thatch were confused now on the situation. Shanks, clean. Please, like that will ever happen. Shanks took steps forward, still glaring at the bandit, who seemed to not realize he was in danger. I don't know why you're here, but I suggest you run away before you get hurt. If you come any closer you're a dead man, coward. He said, pointing his sword at Shanks now, who just ignored him and continued to walk forward. Another bandit stepped into Shanks' path and snarled at him. Didn't you hear what he said? He cocked his gun and pointed it at Shanks' head. Don't take another step or I'll blow your brains out. He said, and Shanks stopped walking. Now that you've drawn your pistol, I assume you're ready to put your life on the line. Shanks said, suddenly taking his eyes off the leader and looking at the bandit beside him. Huh? What are you talking about? He said, confused. I'm saying that a pistol isn't for threats, it's for action. Shanks smiled at the bandit, who looked very confused now as Luffy snuck up and shot the bandit in the head, making the kid's eyes widen in surprise. Luffy had seen people get shot before, but not that close up. Aizu always made sure Luffy was at a safe distance whenever there was a fight, and Pops was always there to protect him. The bandits looked at the dead man in surprise, then looked up at the pirates, while Luffy took a bite of his meat. You killed him, how could you do that, you cowards? One of them said suddenly in shock. Cowards? Don't be naive. Do you think you're dealing with saints? Ben said, glaring at the bandits. The people in front of you are pirates. Listen, bandits, you can throw food and drink on my head and I'll laugh that off, but if you for whatever reason hurt one of my friends, I'll never forgive you. Shanks now glared fully at the bandit, who just began to laugh, not realizing anything. Thatch sighed, putting his sword away. Idiots, I hope Shanks gives it to them. Thatch said. Marco also sighed and relaxed. When Shanks got like this, the bandit stood no chance. We're not going to fight? Sabo asked the men in confusion. Shanks is an emperor just as much as Pops is. If they wanted to fight Shanks, they would need to call out Garp for the task, Yoi. Marco said, rolling his eyes. I'll not forgive you, said. The leader said, cocking his head at Shanks. Pirates who float around on the sea challenging bandits. What a joke. And pointed at Shanks, kill them all, men. He shouted to his group. Shanks was about to take a step forwards, but Ben moved faster. I'll take care of them, I'm more than enough. He said, pulling his rifle out of his sash and staring at the bandits. He pulled his cigarette out of his mouth and burned the forehead of the first bandit to come his way and began to use the back of his rifle to hit the bandits down. Once all were brutally beaten to the ground, Ben lit up another smoke while everyone watched in shock. He pointed his rifle at the leader, who had his mouth hanging open, staring at his fallen men around him. Don't flatter yourself, bandit. Ben said with a grin, if you want to fight us, you should bring a battleship with you next time. He said, and Thatch laughed. See, I told you they'd need the big guns to take on Shanks, Yoi. Marco said offhandedly. Luffy stared wide-eyed at Shanks and Ben, while the bandit looked around now, feeling afraid. So cool. Luffy said out loud, and Shanks had to fight a smile from forming on his face. Wait. The kid provoked us. He said to Shanks, who stared at the bandit leader. Whatever, aren't you a wanted man? Shanks asked with a small smile. Marco sighed. This battle was over. He went to take a step forward when the bandit threw something at the ground and smoke appeared. When it faded away, Luffy and the bandit were gone. Marco's eyes widened as he sprinted towards Shanks, who looked equally as shocked at the sudden change in situation. Spread out, men. Find the kid. He ordered to his crew, and Marco said the same to Thatch. Find Luffy at all costs. Ace, Sabo go find Pops. I'll look from above. And he jumped forwards turning into the phoenix that he was and the groups wasted no time taking action. Ace and Sabo ran as fast as they could back to the Moby Dick where a few commanders were talking to one another and Pops was listening from his chair. Pops. The boys shouted and everyone froze. Luffy has been taken by a bandit. The old man's eyes narrowed and he stood up from his chair. Then we'll just have to get him back. Everyone. Your brother is missing. Spread out and search for him. Bring the bandit back to me. He said and a yell was given as everyone left the ship in search of their little brother. Shanks was panicking. This was his entire fault. He should have killed the bandit as soon as he hurt Luffy, but he wanted to give the kid a show, a reminder as to why he was the strongest one around. He wanted to look good for Luffy and look where it got him. He ran by the docks away from their large ships when he saw Luffy in a small boat out away from the shore. Luffy? He said, why hadn't Marco come out this way yet? He didn't even stop and think, he just jumped right into the water as Luffy was thrown overboard. Shanks picked up speed as he saw Luffy trying his very best to stay above, but his devil fruit abilities were about to bring him under. Someone, anyone. Help me. Luffy shouted as loud as he could despite his situation, and Shanks looked up suddenly to see a large sea king staring at the bandit before eating him whole and crushing the ship. He would have laughed at the irony as a bandit should never have taken to sea without knowing the dangers, but he saw the monster turn its eyes onto Luffy and dive back under to take another attack. Like hell was he going to allow this creature to kill the kid? Luffy was too important to way too many people to die like this. Luffy's death would kill Marco and hurt the family in a way Shanks refused to imagine. He grabbed Luffy as suddenly as the Sea King returned and snapped his jaws around Shanks' arm, tearing it off. He would have cried out, but Luffy's wide eyes of fear kept his mouth shut and his eyes closed. Shanks was pissed now, pissed at the bandit for causing this, pissed at the Sea King for eating his arm. Shanks was full out pissed. He turned his eyes towards the creature and let it know just how mad he was. At lost. And he released a wave of haki scaring the crap out of the monster, sending it as far away as possible. Shanks wasn't sure how long they stood there. He was bleeding into the water, turning it red around them. Hey, how long are you going to keep crying? You're a man, aren't you? He asked but felt like crying himself. Who but Shanks? Your arm. Luffy cried out, holding onto his shirt, tears pouring down his face. What this? It's just an arm. I'm just glad you're safe, Luffy. And he used his other arm to pull the kid closer to him, hugging him tightly as his crying got louder and louder. When they made it back to land, Thatch was there, his eyes wide at the blood covering both Luffy and Shanks. They grew even wider when they saw Shanks' armor lack of. Shanks took a step forward and stumbled. Thatch caught him and helped him down. Luffy was crying loudly, silently blaming himself. Luffy, a real man doesn't cry that much. Shanks said weakly, leaning against a wall, and Thatch called Marco over using his transponder snail. Marco in turn let everyone know they were safe and all rushed towards them. You need to get your arm looked at, Shanks. Ben said, kneeling down to his level, and Shanks smiled softly. Of course I do, Ben. He let everyone help him up and take him back to the Red Force to rest. Luffy cried a lot more into Marco's shirt. SHH, it's alright, Yoi. He said and carried the kid back towards the ship. Pops was standing there looking at them, worry evident on his face. Marco passed the crying child over to him where he returned to hugging Luffy. You're safe, my son, nothing can hurt you now. He said, but Luffy just continued to cry until he fell asleep. Thatch looked up at the kid, knowing the pain he must be feeling. The bandit's dead, eaten by a Sea King. He reported to his father, who shook his head. Took the easy way out. He said, annoyed he didn't get the chance to punish a man for hurting his son. The thing ate off Shanks' arm. I think those are tears of fear rather than sadness. He reported, and the older man nodded his head. He may have nightmares, Yoi. Marco said. Ace and Sabo stood back and watched the scene, but stepped forward finally. Then we'll protect him. If nightmares are on their way, then we'll fight them off. Sabo said, pointing a thumb at himself, and grinned widely at the men. As long as we're his brothers, nothing will ever touch him again, not even nightmares. Ace said, crossing his arms and glaring slightly, daring anyone to challenge his statement. We'll be counting on you. Haruta said, coming up behind Ace and kissing his cheek. Ace blushed in surprise and tried to wipe it off. Sabo laughed at him until he got his own kiss, reacting the exact same way as Ace. The next morning Luffy woke up in Marco's bed. He wasn't too sure when he fell asleep, but he knew he was hungry. He got up excited about food when the memories of yesterday crept in and his stomach dropped. Shanks, he whispered, and Marco opened the door looking at him and smiling. I was wondering when you were going to get up. Food's ready, Yoi. He said, but Luffy looked away. Not hungry anymore. He said, and Marco sat down on the bed looking at him. Shanks is alright, Yoi. He said, making Luffy look up. He is. Marco nodded his head. It's going to take a bit more than a Sea King to take out that guy. Come and let's go eat and we'll go check up on him. Sound good, Yoi? Luffy nodded his head and took Marco's hand and walked towards breakfast. After breakfast they did go see Shanks. Marco took Luffy to the Red Force but chose to wait outside and let them talk. "That's Shanks," Luffy said as he opened the door to Shanks' room. "Common in, kid," he said, and Luffy ran to the bed where he was resting. "I'm sorry," he shouted and hugged Shanks tightly. "There's nothing to apologize for, Lou. I'd do what I did again in a heartbeat, you're too important to me," he said softly and allowed the kid to cuddle into his side, resting his head on Shanks' chest. "Did it hurt?" he whispered, and Shanks looked at the ceiling. "Of course it did, but losing you would hurt a whole lot more." Luffy felt tears building in his eyes and blinked, trying to stop them. "You're the coolest ever, Shanks," he said, making the man laugh loudly. "Don't you ever forget it, kid." Luffy laughed softly along with him. He was still sad about Shanks' arm, but he was happy to have his hero still alive. "You're leaving now?" he said as Shanks walked into his ship, a new cape covering the missing arm, his red hair blowing in the wind. "Yup, looks like you guys will be as well," he said. Luffy pulled the straw hat onto his head and tried to give his smile to the man. "I'm still going to miss you," he said, and Shanks laughed. "You better." He turned towards the kids who were watching him before smiling at them. "We didn't get to talk much with everything that happened. I've heard a lot about you both from Luffy. I'm leaving him in your care," he said, and Ace and Sabo's eyes widened before they attempted to not look embarrassed. "We'll take care of him," Ace said, grinning up at Shanks, who returned it as a spark of recognition passed through his eyes, and he looked at Ace a little bit longer. "What's your name, kid?" Shanks asked Ace, who now studied the man, his smile dropping quickly. Portgas D. Ace," he said, and Shanks' eyes lit up in excitement as a memory of a beautiful woman flashed through his mind and a dark-haired captain who loved that girl. "What a nice strong name you have, kid." And with that he turned and left. Ace just looked at him in confusion. What did the man know? "Boy Akagami," Marco shouted out, suddenly making him stop and turn back towards them. "I owe you for this, thank you for saving him, Yoi," he said truthfully. "Then why don't you?" Dottie started, but Marco's eye twitched before he shouted. "Never." Shanks laughed and waved goodbye. He was telling Luffy the truth that morning. He would give up his arm once more if it meant that the kid could survive to see another day. Heck, he'd give up his life for that kid, and he got to see something interesting. Portgas D. Ace, he recognized that name. The lover of his captain shared that name. Ace did look a lot like her, but shared Roger's dark hair and eyes. "I wonder just how the world will change with them as siblings." Shanks laughed. A brotherhood of D's, the world would never be the same, and Shanks couldn't wait to see that. It was raining out and had been for the past few days. "I'm bored." Luffy whined into the dinner table, putting his head against it, annoyed with the rain. "We'll be out of the area soon enough, try and be positive, Lou," Thatch said, collecting some of the dishes that were left over from lunch. "I want to be out of it now." He whined louder. Luffy, who was 8 years old, wanted to play on his beloved deck, and when it rained not even Pop sat outside. "Well, too bad, kid, you and water don't mix well, so you're stuck in here till it's all over with." And with that, Thatch went back into the kitchen to start on his dishes, and with the amount of siblings on this ship, the dishes were plenty. If he wasn't careful he could be washing dishes all day. At this point in time though, Luffy was getting frustrated. He wanted to go out and play, not be stuck inside the galley all day. Sabo was reading a book he had gotten from her about navigation, and Ace was heading to the kitchen to talk with Thatch, but secretly wouldn't mind helping him with the dishes. Marco was in his own room finishing up work that needed to be done, and Pops was resting in his room. The rain sometimes made Pops feel a little sick and sore, so the nurses were all over making him rest on those days. All of the commanders were doing something to occupy their time, well, all except one. Luffy saw Aizu sitting in his spot at the dinner table, a cup of coffee beside him and paper and a pen in front of him. Luffy had no one else to visit, so he snuck up quietly and gave the cross-dresser a big hug. "Luffy?" he said in surprise. He was so into his drawing that he didn't hear the kid coming towards him. Luffy smiled widely and climbed onto his lap. "Whatcha Drawin?" he asked, looking down at the picture, not sure what all of the arrows and numbers meant, but Aizu smiled at the kid. "I'm drawing the design for some new clothes. The crew can't keep wearing the same things forever, kid." Luffy laughed with his brother since he liked getting new clothes from him. "Next time you should draw something I can wear in the rain." Luffy laughed, then pouted, remembering that it was still raining and wanting it to end quickly. Aizu looked at the boy for a moment curiously before a smile came to his face. "I think I might have something to help you out there, brat," Aizu said with a smile, picking the kid up and walking off towards his room, taking the longer route to avoid the rain. Aizu, being the one to make the clothing for the crew, had everything and anything for just in case problems and sudden inspiration moments. He couldn't help but smile wider as this was going to be one of those special times. Sitting Luffy down on his bed, he went to work grabbing everything and anything he might need from their properly placed spots in his room. Strips of rubber cloth and warm padding underneath, he started to sew together at an amazing speed, the fabrics creating a bright rubber coat. "Luffy, here is a new jacket for you." He smiled and held up the coat. It was red in color with a small lion growling at the bottom of it. Aizu added that for an extra touch. "But this on you'll keep dry from the rain." Luffy jumped on the bed and reached for the mystery coat. He absolutely loved it. Aizu helped him put it on before putting one on himself over his kimono and picking up a large umbrella and a smaller one from a cabinet in the corner of his room. "We can only play at a certain spot on the ship to avoid the waves, okay Luffy?" Luffy nodded his head and followed his brother out onto the deck. This part of the deck was surrounded by walls and further away from the railing, so Aizu figured he would be safe here from the roaring waves. The rain was falling, but as Thatch said they were moving out of that area, so the rain should stop soon enough. Luffy jumped around and splashed in the puddles, his laughter ringing across the loud waves, his umbrella being held over his head with his small hands. Luffy loved this. Aizu smiled watching the kid playing around in the rain. It was times like this that remind him how Luffy brought such an innocence to the ship that was never there before. He closed his eyes and tried to remember the times when Luffy wasn't on the ship but found he could no longer. Luffy completed this crew in a way they didn't think possible, him and those brats. "Aizu. Come play with me." Luffy had dropped his umbrella and was reaching his hand out to the older brother. Aizu grinned and took the little hand before splashing in a large puddle, sending water towards the kid who giggled and splashed back. The two played like this for an hour before Marco came out of his room to check if the rain had stopped yet. He looked around and his eyes widened a bit, seeing both Luffy and Aizu soaking wet and laughing loudly. Marco couldn't help the smile that came to his own face at the scene. Turning back to his room, he walked to his table, pulled a camera from his drawer and walked towards the brothers to get the moment documented for the old man. Once finished taking the picture, Marco put the camera away and saw Thatch watching from the galley doorway with a smile on his own face. "It's nice to see them like this," Thatch said with a smile. "It's weird to see Aizu playing in the rain, normally the man hates anything that could ruin his hair or makeup yoi," Marco said, returning the smile. "Luffy gets what he wants when he wants it," Thatch replied with a shrug. It was a known fact for the crew. The rain had all but stopped now, and the two brothers were smiling even though they were soaked. This was the most fun Aizu had had in a while, so he was now glad Luffy had come to sit on his lap this afternoon. "Aizu, look." Luffy got the cross-dresser's attention by pointing at the rainbow that was now shining in the sky. They smiled as the rain had passed. "Oh, get yourselves dried off yoi," Marco said, climbing down now to visit the two. "I don't want you to get sick again Luffy, so make sure you take a hot bath as well yoi." Luffy whined at the thought of having to take a bath, but Aizu patted him on the shoulder. "I'll take it with you, sound okay brat?" Aizu grinned at him and Luffy grinned back, guessing it was alright to have a bath with his big brother. Marco and Thatch smiled at the exchange between the two, happy to see them both having fun as the sun started to shine brightly. Line break. It was midnight when Pops heard a knock on his door. He could sense it was his youngest son, so he beckoned him in. "What's wrong, my son?" he asked, hearing the sniffles coming from the kid, alerting the older man that Luffy was crying. "I had a bad dream," he said, climbing up onto the older man's chest and lying down. "Do you want to talk about it?" he questioned while rubbing the kid's back soothingly. "Thatch was eaten by a big monster," he said and closed his eyes, afraid the monster would come back. "What kind of monster?" he asked Luffy, who kept his eyes closed. Pops kept rubbing his back softly. "A mean, scary one that ate Thatch and then ate Ace," he said, his voice choking up from tears that might come again. "Shhhh, it's all alright Luffy, no one can hurt you here. There isn't a monster in this world I can't protect this family from," Whitebeard said soothingly, and Luffy looked up at him with hopeful eyes. "Your brothers are very strong, so have faith in them alright," he said and began to hum for the boy. Luffy listened, hugging the old man tight and falling asleep on his chest. When Marco woke up and didn't find Luffy in his room, panic surged through his veins. What if the kid got up in the middle of the night, slipped and fell off the ship? What if he drowned while everyone was asleep? What if his brother was dead? Marco by this point in time had put himself into a small panic that Thatch had to slap him on the back to get him to calm down. "If he's not with you and not with me, he's probably with Pops," Thatch said, rolling his eyes and pushing Marco into the general direction towards Pop's room. Marco may be a fearless pirate who has fought and won many battles on the sea, but if you add Luffy into this equation, he turns into a worrisome mother hen that can't function unless he knows his brother is safe. Ace and Sabo had figured that Luffy went to sleep with one of the commanders that night, since that was a normal occurrence for them. Luffy would decide at dinner he wanted to cuddle with Marco, and he would get what he wanted, so they weren't that surprised to wake up and find him gone. Marco knocked on Pop's door and heard him call for them to enter. When they did enter and saw Luffy still deeply asleep on his chest while the older man was humming happily, they couldn't help but smile. "Has he been here all night yoi?" Marco asked quietly, trying not to wake the sleeping child. Since midnight or so. He got in reply. Thatch raised his eyebrow in question. Why didn't the kid come to one of them? He had a nightmare. That answered one of their questions. Now they had more. Did he tell you what it was about? Thatch asked, pulling up a chair in his pop's room, Marco following along. He said he saw a monster eat both you and Ace. He said, looking towards Thatch. This caught his attention from an earlier memory. He's still having that nightmare? Thatch asked. Even Marco was concerned because he had heard about this nightmare once before. He has had this already? Whitebeard asked his elder sons. He came to me one night saying he had a nightmare of me being eaten by a dark monster. You said he now sees Ace being eaten as well? Thatch asked, worry in his voice. Yes, he mentioned Ace being eaten as well. All fell silent for a moment, taking in this information. He's inquisitive. He senses things in people that we sometimes miss. Thatch said, slowly, thinking of the times Luffy had seen the good in most people and sometimes seeing the bad. His own mind thinking back to Teach and the way Luffy never is comfortable near him but dismissing it quickly. Teach is one of their brothers, nothing to need worrying about there. But as far as we know, Luffy can't predict the future, so this dream could be just that, a dream, Yoi. Marco said, pointing out the obvious. We'll keep an eye on him but keep guard in case. Thatch. Pop said something had been feeling weird lately. The world was beginning to change, but he wasn't sure if it was a good change or a bad one yet. Luffy slowly began to open his eyes and saw the room with his two brothers and father awake. Good yawn morning, he said, which was quite cute to the men in the room. Good morning, Luffy. Did you sleep well, Yoi? Marco asked, sitting on the edge of the bed to talk with him better. Man. It's comfy here. Pops can chase away all monsters, right, Pops? Luffy gave his wide smile towards the man who returned it. Of course, brat. Luffy got up off of Whitebeard and climbed into Marco's arms. Is breakfast ready? He looked towards Thatch, who gave his smile. What a silly question, bud, let's go eat. And with a loud cheer, Luffy was out of Marco's lap and dragging Thatch towards the kitchen. I'm glad he's feeling energetic, Yoi. Marco smiled, watching them go. I pity the poor fool who gets coaxed into being his chief. Garara. Pops laughed. So do I, Yoi. And they both got up and headed for the galley before Luffy ate everything on the tables. Marco was still worried for his brother but chose to just keep watch for now. If any monsters appeared on this ship, he'd deal with them personally, his eyes flashing icy blue, sealing the promise in his heart. When Ace woke up, he was a bit surprised not to find Luffy sleeping beside him when he was pretty sure he went to bed with both him and Sabo that night. Sabo, wake up. Ace nudged his brother, who was sprawled out on the bed they shared. Sabo sab sabby ... Sabuo. Ace bugged him annoyingly. What? Go away, Ace. Just a bit longer. He slurred out and rolled over, taking the blankets with him, a tick of annoyance appearing on Ace's forehead. DCH, fine. He said, getting up from the bed, deciding to go look for Luffy, though he was surprised to see it was just barely dawn. Luffy liked to sleep right until breakfast was ready, no earlier and no later, so it was times like this that threw the kid off. Ace decided the first place to check was the kitchen because if anything, Luffy would follow his stomach first and this would be the place to go. Ace walked in and saw Thatch, his hair not yet in its normal style but in a ponytail hanging down his back. You're up early, brat. Thatch said fondly to Ace, who waved in response. Yo, Luffy was gone. Was all he needed to say, causing Thatch to smile softly towards Ace. Yeah, he got up about an hour ago. Thatch said with his smile, and Ace tilted his head, confused. That was way before the sun was up. Why? Thatch turned back towards the breakfast he was starting before talking. Marco's going away on a mission for the day and won't be back until probably after dinner tonight. He said, his voice tight but his smile still there. Doesn't he do missions? Ace knew the commanders went out and protected the territories or dealt with stupid rookies, so Ace wasn't sure why it was a big deal. I forgot this is the first time Marco's gone out with you guys here. Thatch said, shaking his head, making Ace feel even more lost. Luffy and Marco, since they've been together so long, they have a special bond, you could say. They worry about each other and are very protective of one another. You've already witnessed that through Marco plenty of times already though. Thatch said, laughing. Ace nodded his head, knowing how scary Marco could get if Luffy was threatened at all. Luffy doesn't like it when Marco goes on missions. He worries so much about his brother that he has to see him off every time. Understanding finally came to Ace. So that's why he was up early. He said, nodding his head now. Yup, he needs to tell Marco to be safe and come home soon. He's done it every single time for as long as I can remember. Thatch said, now warming up the stove to begin the bacon for the crew. I see, but Marco will be back, right? Ace asked cautiously. Of course. He's not the first division commander for nothing, you know. Marco's strong, so have faith, little brother. Thatch said, now cracking eggs, making many different forms for the picky eaters and the not so picky eaters in his family. Where is Luffy? Ace asked, looking around, finally remembering why he came to the kitchen in the first place. He's probably on the figurehead, he won't be coming to the galley for breakfast, so we'll have to make sure he gets his meals whenever he decides to eat. Thatch said, removing the bacon from one end of the stove onto a plate where it could cool safely. Why won't he eat with everyone? Ace was now once again confused by his little brother's actions. Because he wants to be the first person to welcome Marco home when he returns. Thatch laughed and Ace shook his head. Thatch placed an egg onto a plate with some crispy bacon and a few pieces of toast, handing it to Ace, who just stared at it. Bring this to Luffy, he probably might want more than this, but he will need to come to get that himself. Thatch said to Ace, who nodded his head in understanding. When Ace got out to the figurehead, he couldn't help but smile at the kid who was curled up with a pillow and blanket around him. "Hey Lou," he said, getting the kid's attention. He rolled over on his back and smiled up at Ace. "Hi. Wanna cuddle?" he said and lifted his blanket up to let Ace in. "Eat something first," he said, sitting down beside the kid, who finally took notice of the food. "Ah, food," Luffy shouted and crawled over towards the plate, eating everything rather quickly. "Thanks for the meal," he shouted and clapped his hands together. Ace shook his head and sighed. "If you're still hungry, we can probably get more at the galley," he said, and Luffy frowned at him. I can't miss Marco," he said, his eyes wide and surprisingly serious. "He won't be back for a long time, Lou, you won't miss him," Ace said reassuringly. "No, I'm not moving till he comes back," Luffy said and pulled the blanket tighter around himself before plopping down onto his pillow and stare at the sea. "Are you going to take a nap?" Ace was confused on why Luffy was with his pillow. "Nope, gonna rest and wait," he said and continued to watch the sea. "Move over," Ace said and crawled into the blanket beside Luffy. "Yay. Ace is cuddling," Luffy cheered while Ace just rolled his eyes. "I am not. I'm just cold, dummy," he said while staring at the dark, watching the stars fade one by one into the morning sky. "Line break. What in the world are you both doing?" Sabo said, looking down at the two brothers who were sleeping soundly on the figurehead. Sabo face-palmed in annoyance. "Leave it to these two to fall asleep in the most dangerous place possible." "Sleeping, go away," Ace said, rolling over, placing his face onto Luffy's back, and the kid was snoring. "Sleeping on the figurehead," he said, annoyed at the brothers. "Obviously," Ace responded, pulling the blanket up towards his chin now before his eyes snapped open. "Shit. I wasn't meant to fall asleep," he said, sitting up quickly while Luffy was curled up in a ball, his black messy hair covering his eyes, his beloved straw hat sitting right beside him, the edges fluttering with the wind. "You'll miss breakfast," Sabo said and took a step back, expecting Luffy to jump up, but was surprised when he didn't. "What's wrong with him?" Sabo panicked, staring at the still sleeping boy. "He already ate breakfast." Ace shrugged his shoulders. "But when?" Sabo asked. "I know, a while ago. It was dark out still," Ace replied while brushing his dark curls out of his face. "He was up before us." Sabo sat down this time to talk with his brother. "Yeah, Marco's gone on a mission and he doesn't like that very much apparently," Ace said, smiling softly at Luffy, who rolled over facing them, his mouth slightly open and a trail of drool hanging down. "I see, he must be worried," Sabo said, quietly looking at the kid. Man, that's what Thatch said," Ace sighed. "Luffy," Sabo said, shaking the kid slightly to wake him up. "Ah, Sabo. Mornin'," Luffy slurred out and yawned. "Mornin', wanna come get more food? I think the chef's made lots today," Sabo said, reaching his hand out to the kid, who shook his head. "No thanks, I'ma wait for Marco." And he pulled his blanket closer and pushed Ace off his pillow, who grumbled a bit from the action. Luffy just rested his head against it and watched the sea. Every once in a while he took a nap, but most of the time he would keep his eyes on the horizon, waiting for his beloved big brother to come home to him. Ace and Sabo had made it their job to ensure Luffy was eating all day. They knew he wasn't that sad from the amount of times he begged them to bring him food. He ate and ate his way through each meal. Though the boys were very happy about him eating properly, they were very annoyed to be treated like servants. They were exhausted from running all around the ship to keep their baby brother's mind off of Marco being away. They played cards, made crafts, ate snacks and just talked. It was actually quite fun for the boys to spend an entire day just to themselves with no adults popping in. Thatch watched from a distance and thought of joining them, but it was Haruta who shook her head with a smile. "Let them be, those boys sure do know how to bring out the best in him." She smiled tenderly towards the kids who were finishing up another game of goldfish. "Don't they?" Thatch laughed, he really believed they did. Luffy shined when he was with his family, but he sparkled when he was with those boys he called his brothers. He chose to take her advice and make a snack for them. Something strawberry sounded nice, and with that Thatch retreated back to the kitchen. By the end of the night, Marco had returned from his mission like he had been expected to. "Welcome back, anything exciting happen?" Thatch asked, coming to welcome his brother home. The usual yoi. Stupid rookies thinking they can take over Pop's territories, when will they ever learn? Marco shrugged his shoulders and rolled his lazy eyes before looking around. Where's Luffy? It was a rare thing for him not to be there to greet Marco home. I know he was waiting for you to come home all day. Thatch said, just as surprised, looking around for his hyper little brother, only to not find him. He was waiting all day, yoi. Though he shouldn't be surprised, Luffy has always been this way. Yeah, he sat on the figurehead all day. Ah. The figurehead. Thatch said, knowing just where to find the kid. The man walked towards the front of the ship to find the cutest scene possible. Ace, Sabo and Luffy were all fast asleep, curled up together on the figurehead, a thin blanket thrown over top of them and one pillow being shared between them. Though Luffy seemed to find Ace's stomach a better pillow as he snuggled on his brother. Marco smiled softly at the scene and Thatch bent down to poke Ace on the cheek to wake him up. But he whined out, slapping Thatch's finger away from his face. Wakey wakey sleeping beauty. Thatch said in a sing-song voice, and Ace glared daggers at the man once he opened his eyes. Say that again, I dare you. Ace growled out and Thatch grinned mischievously. Wakey, Thatch began before Marco cuffed him behind the head. Shut up, Thatch yoi. He said in annoyance. Luffy, hearing the shouting, opened his eyes to see Marco standing by Ace, while Sabo, who was just beginning to wake up himself, looked around at the commotion. The image of Marco finally hit the kid's slow mind and he jumped up, tackling the man around the waist in a hug. Welcome home, Marco. Luffy shouted, stuffing his face into Marco's shirt, holding his brother tight. I'm home, yoi. He said softly, returning the hug fully. He was home. Ace and Sabo smiled at the scene, happy to see Luffy so happy. Shall we go grab a snack? You guys missed dinner, so I'll see what I can whip up for you all. Thatch said, grinning as Luffy let Marco go and stuffed his straw hat on his dark hair. Can I help? Ace asked and Thatch patted the kid on his orange cowboy hat. Why, of course. He said, and they both walked towards the kitchen. I want to hear all about your mission. Sabo said excitedly to Marco, who laughed. Alright, but it's not that exciting, yoi. He shook his head when Luffy's eyes brightened. But you had an adventure, so it must be. Marco continued to shake his head at the kids but followed behind Thatch, happy to be back home where he belonged. The Whitebeard crew was reaching a summer island and Luffy was more than super excited. The large crew had just left a winter island and although Luffy loved snow, he missed the heat and sunshine every now and then. Hops. Can we go exploring together? Luffy asked excitedly, grabbing hold of the older man's hand. Whitebeard smiled widely underneath his mustache. Sure, my son, but only for a little bit, we don't want the nurses angry. He said and laughed while Luffy laughed with him. Mind if I tag along, yoi? Marco asked, smiling up at Pops and Luffy. Amen. He shouted, happy to have more people to play with. I'm sure these two would like to come as well, so why don't we all walk around for a while, eh? Thatch said, walking towards them with Sabo and Ace beside him, who were both grinning. Do I even want to know what those smiles are from, yoi? Marco asked suspiciously to his best friend and the brats. Yeah, probably not. Ace said and smirked mischievously to the man, making Marco's brow twitch. If something's happened to my division, yoi, he started, and Thatch laughed loudly. Lighten up, Marco. It's just a bit of fun, that's all. Thatch said with his grin that worried Marco further. Yeah, ma. Stop being such a cranky bastard. Luffy shouted down to the man, who now turned quickly to glare up at Luffy. Thatch, who hadn't heard Luffy call anyone that in a while, doubled over in laughter while Ace and Sabo tried to fight off their own forming smiles. Whitebeard laughed softly before scolding Luffy for using inappropriate words, which only caused Luffy to give a pout up towards his father. But Thatch's division calls ma that all the time. He defended for himself and that caused Thatch to stop laughing. Oh, do they now, yoi? Marco said, his blue eyes sparking dangerously. Listen, Marco, you know I don't have complete control over our siblings, they say what they want. Thatch said, placing his hands in front of him to protect himself. Why don't I show them what a real cranky bastard looks like, yoi? He said dangerously, taking a step forward. No fighting. Luffy whined, now kicking his feet from where he was sitting on Pop's lap. We're not Lu, don't worry. Thatch said to the kid, who eyed him, his hand still up defensively though. I'll get you for this, yoi. Marco said, huffing in defeat. Whitebeard patted Luffy on the head as he helped the kid back down to the ground. Hey Lu, I heard this island has the best parks around. Sabo said excitedly, since he had been studying up on every island they came in contact with. Really, he said with excitement as Thatch rolled his eyes. You guys just want to go to the park. He said with a chuckle, making Luffy pout. I've never been to a park. I dunno what one looks like. Luffy scowled while Sabo gave a crooked smile, knowing Luffy had grown up on the ship his entire life and never got to experience things like that. Ace had his head turned to the side as well. I've never been to a park either, he said, confused on why Luffy was getting excited about this. If that's what they want then so be it. Pop said, standing up, removing his medical equipment carefully as to not anger his nurses. The nurses will probably prefer that over wandering the island. He said, smiling down at the children when the grown men just sighed knowing that they had lost. Alright, but parks are rather boring, Pops. Thatch said, shrugging his shoulders, but smiled. We'll have to keep an eye on the brats, Yoy. Marco said, but Pops wasn't listening. He was watching the kids talk excitedly about the park they might visit. As a man who sailed on the seas, he chose to not stay on the land very long or too often, but if it meant that his youngest sons could learn something new and smile a little brighter, then he would do anything. Sounds like fun, Gurara, he said, and they all smiled back. Line break. When they got to the island, it looked much like a party island filled with amusement at every turn. There were vendors offering trinkets, flowers, games, and fun. Luffy's eyes couldn't have shone brighter. Hold my hand, brat, I don't want you getting lost, Yoy. Marco said, taking hold of Luffy's hand, but the kid was looking around in excitement. We need to play some games while we're here. Luffy shouted to everyone, who just laughed. We'll have to make sure that happens, kid. Thatch said with a grin, while Ace and Sabo looked at everything, taking it all in, as they had never seen an island like this before. Let's go find a park to play in. Luffy said, reminding everyone why they were there in the first place. Marco smiled down at the kid, taking the lead and leading them towards one of the many attractive parks on the fun island. The park that was mentioned on a sign to be the most fun had a huge jungle gym filled with slides, ropes and ladders. Different games and swings were close by, with sandboxes and bars to climb on. Luffy's eyes began to sparkle along with Sabo's. Ace looked away and scoffed, but the slight blush on his cheeks gave away how excited he actually was to be here. Thatch thought this was a good idea after all. He at first doubted the idea of taking the kids to a park since heck, they were pirates, and this just wasn't done. Though the looks on the kids' faces made him smile, which made the unpirate-like behaviors worth it. They'd have to beat up some rival crews in the near future to make up for this though. I can go play, ma, can't I? Luffy asked excitedly, still holding on to Marco's hand. Go have fun, brat. Pop said, looking for a bench to sit on. The families around the park were giving the grown men strange looks, but Marco and Thatch weren't bothered by them, and Pops never cared as long as his sons were happy. Luffy climbed everything right to the top and slid down the slides just as fast his laugh could be heard across the playground. Sabo was exploring everything. He liked to dream about going to a play park as a young child, but was never actually allowed to go to one. He had seen other children play there, but never thought he would get the chance. Ace was on the swings. It had taken him a while to learn how to work them, but once he figured it out and got going, he absolutely loved it. It felt like flying. You're pretty good at that. A little girl said. She had blonde hair and blue eyes and was smiling at Ace kindly. Yeah, of course I am. He said, slowing down fully on the swing to talk with the girl, but he was feeling rather suspicious as to why she was talking to him in the first place. He started to look around for his brothers since he felt uncomfortable around this girl all alone. I'm Sakura, what's your name? She said, taking a seat on the swing beside Ace, who was still looking around. Ace. He said, not really looking at her, but she giggled. What y'all looking for? And this time he looked at her. My brothers. He said simply, and she hummed a little in understanding. Well, what do they look like? She said, pushing her pale blonde hair out of her face back into its clips. Well, one has a straw hat and the other a top hat. He said, blushing in embarrassment while she laughed. I think I see the one in the straw hat, he's about to jump off the top there. She said, pointing to the top of the jungle gym where Luffy had himself ready to jump. Marco stood up just as he did that, ready to go into protective mode, but was stopped short when Sabo grabbed Luffy by the back of the shirt, pulling him down. And that's my other brother. Ace said, sweat dropping slightly, while the girl just laughed loudly. They look fun, why don't we go play a game together? She said, standing up, offering her hand out to Ace, who looked at it suspiciously. It's just a hand, it's not going to bite you. She said as he took it hesitantly and followed her towards his brothers. Thatch had a wicked grin on his face and his eyes sparkled dangerously. Do you guys see what I see? He said through his grin, and Marco shook his head but smiled despite himself while Pops laughed at the scene. Looks like we'll have to keep an eye on our brats, they might become popular someday. Pop said, his eyes sparkling as Ace was blushing furiously. Ace had never held hands with anyone before other than his brothers and the crew, so he had no idea what to do in this situation. Sabo spotted Ace and his brow rose in confusion. Luffy was looking where Sabo was looking and jumped down to Ace and the girl. Hey, Ace. He said with his toothy grin. The girl laughed. Ace, do you have a fever or something? Your face is all red, Luffy said, looking at his older brother with worry, making the girl chuckle a bit louder. I'm fine, idiot. He said, glaring at the boy, who shrugged his shoulders. Sabo was grinning at them before bowing deeply. Forgive my brothers, miss, they're a little inexperienced around girls. My name is Sabo, may I ask yours? Sabo said from practice living with a noble family. Sakura and those are my friends, Akahana and Ruka. She said waving towards her friends who were approaching them, but she was still holding Ace's hand firmly. The two girls approached and smiled kindly at them. Luffy grinned happy to meet other people, but stayed close to Sabo. The memory of his first time with other children resurfacing, and he didn't want another situation like that. Hey, I'm Sabo and that's Ace and Luffy. Sabo said bowing at the new people who had come. Luffy grabbed hold of Sabo's jacket and looked at the girls with a smile, but wanted to just stay with his brothers. I'm Akahana, but you can call me Hana. One of them said to Luffy. She had bright red hair and purple eyes. Luffy cautiously took the hand that was reached out to him and shook it. He remembered Marco doing that one time. Sit down, Marco. Thatch said as the blonde made a move to get up and show the girls just who was watching over them and every reason why Luffy should not be involved. Let him make friends, son, he needs to grow. Pop said but was watching them carefully. I'm Luffy. Luffy said. The girl Hana smiled to him. Wanna play with me? She asked and Luffy nodded his head happy to play some more. I'm Ruka, nice to meet you. She said with her black hair and blue eyes. She was taller than the other girls. Her hair was longer as well, but pulled back into a ponytail that went down her back. Same to you. So what game do you girls have in mind? He said smirking and Ruka gave the same smile. Well, how about, and off they went playing tag, hide and seek, and every other game they could think of or even make up. Marco was watching Luffy laugh and smile at this girl and crossed his arms in annoyance. Thatch was thinking up all of the ways to embarrass Ace from now on and use this little knowledge to his best advantage. Ops was watching them play, not used to seeing Luffy run so much. As large as the Moby Dick was, Luffy could only run a certain distance before he was out of places to go. Ops, come play with me. Luffy said, running towards the grown men who were sitting on a bench. I enjoy just watching my son. The older man said to his littlest child as the red-haired girl stood a distance back, her eyes widening, and Marco was watching her expectantly. He figured once the girls knew who they were with they would back off. He couldn't help but sigh knowing the outcome. I'm Akahana. The girl said, stepping forward, surprising Marco and smiling up at the great man who looked down at her. She's my friend. Luffy shouted and Whitebeard smiled back at her. You're big. She said and he laughed. You're little. Luffy giggled cheerfully at the interaction before pulling his friend back towards the others who were beginning another game. The afternoon passed swiftly and the three brothers couldn't ever remember when they have ever had so much fun. Marco and the group stood up signaling it was time to go, and the friend said goodbye. It was nice to meet you. Sakura said to Ace, who just blushed. Yeah, you too. He said, looking away, his arms crossed. I hope we meet again someday and you can tell me more about your adventures. Ruka said to Sabo, who bowed politely. You're funny, I hope we can meet again someday. Akahana said to Luffy, who just put his hands behind his head and grinned with a laugh. Of course. He cheered. The three girls looked at one another before giving a smile in understanding. They walked to the three brothers' sides and gave them a kiss on the cheek before giggling and running off, waving backwards towards the boys, two of whom were very shocked. Ace was sure he was going to have a fever by the end of the day from all of his blushing he had been doing. He put his hand to his cheek where she had kissed him. Sabo, who had never had this happen before, had a faint pink on his cheeks, his own hands brushing his cheek. Luffy laughed and ran to hug a very fuming Marco, who was glaring in the direction of the little girl. How dare she do that to his little brother? Thatch was looking like the cat that ate the canary, staring down at a now very uncomfortable Ace. Pops had a soft smile on his own face looking at the children. Can we go home now? I'm tired. Luffy whined, giving no acknowledgement to the fact that he was just kissed, even childishly. Sure, sounds like a good plan. I'm rather tired as well, Yoi. Marco said, but it was Pops that picked Luffy up and carried him on his shoulders. Let's go home, my sons. Luffy nodded and rested his chin on the old man's head, closing his eyes, drifting slowly to sleep. Thatch picked up Ace, putting him on his back, and Sabo took hold of Marco's hand. The three men walked back to the great ship smiling. It had been an adventurous day and one they would never forget. Another gunshot blasted outside the door of the brat's room and a wail of pain accompanied the sound. Ace, I'm scared, Luffy said, curling up in a ball covering his ears with his small hands. Ace wrapped an arm tightly around his little brother, allowing him to take comfort from his presence. It'll be alright, Marco's out there with Pops and Thatch and the other commanders, they're strong, right? Sabo said to the boy, who had now closed his eyes, trying to not see the flashes of sparks from underneath their door. But what if something bad happens to them? Luffy asked quietly. There's nothing we can do but wait, Lu. Ace said, his eyes hard with determination, staring at the door just in case. Ace was now running his hands through Luffy's dark hair, doing about anything to calm the boy down even just a little. Sabo had his pipe in his hands, ready to fight should he need to. Ace's pipe was leaning against a wall. He didn't grab it like Sabo, but he knew should danger come he would move into action right away. Sabo was pacing the room and listening to everything all at the same time. He listened to each gunshot, listened to each cry, to each call of anger, and at times he thought just maybe the battle was ending, only to hear it fire up once more. Whoever was attacking the ship was doing a damn good job it seemed. Pops is strong, Pops is strong, Pops is strong, Luffy started to say to himself like a mantra, his eyes now tightly closed as the battle began to grow closer to their end of the ship. Ace wanted to grab his pipe but felt the need to remain by Luffy's side as the kid began to shake. Sabo looked at Ace knowing from his expression what he wanted but couldn't grab, so he went into action to deliver the weapon. Should something happen, what's our plan? Sabo asked Ace after giving him the pipe while hoping not to startle Luffy. Well, I dunno, we're in the middle of the freaking ocean, it's not like we have anywhere else to go. Ace said offhandedly, but that caused Luffy's eyes to snap open and his head to turn quickly towards Ace. Relieving panic and fear could be heard in the boy's voice, well there went not startling Luffy. I don't want to go. I don't want to leave Marco and Pops and everyone. I don't want to. His voice began to grow louder and louder as fear took over the child's mind. Hey, I thought I heard something. A voice said from outside the door. Looks like that backup plan might be a good idea right about now, Ace. Sabo said, putting his pipe in front of him defensively. It sounds like they have only begun to move this way, the main battle must be closer to the main deck, if we make a break for it, we can probably get to the infirmary. That way there we will be surrounded better and safer than we are here. Ace said, now pulling Luffy's head into the crook of his neck and shoulder, holding the boy closer while he began to cry. Sabo nodded, agreeing with the plan. The room they were in now was not very safe and anyone could break in at any given moment, the fact no one had was a miracle by far. So we need to get to the infirmary. He said to Ace, who nodded, pushing Luffy away from him. He took a deep breath, steeling his nerves. Luffy, stop crying. He shouted at the kid who was still sniffling, ready to begin again. If you don't stop crying, I'll leave you behind. Luffy bit his upper lip and stopped all of his crying right there, and then, the only thing giving away he was still sad was the quivering lip and a few unshed tears in his eyes. We need to get out of this room. Ace began, only to be cut off by Luffy. But Marco said not to leave it at all. He pointed out and Ace nodded his head sadly. I know, but it's no longer safe here. We need to get to the infirmary where there will be nurses and other stronger people guarding it. This room can trap us should someone come in since there's no other escape route. Ace said, not knowing just how much Luffy would understand. So it's a mystery. Luffy said, his eyes widening dark chocolate brown, looking up into Ace's own eyes before he sighed. Sure, why not? He said, pulling Luffy to his feet. Sabo stood behind them. Ace took the lead, opening the door softly and looking around for anyone. Once he figured it was clear, he beckoned his brothers to follow him. Ace kept Luffy behind him and Sabo watched the kids back. Both the older brothers were going to protect their little brother no matter what. They thought they were doing alright since no one was around them and the ship had become a lot quieter. Ace was right when he said the main battle was taking place on the front part of the ship, but it seemed to have made its way through where they were by the dead bodies surrounding the floor. Luffy's eyes were wide with fear and Ace and Sabo began to feel bad about him seeing this. We need to keep moving. Sabo said to Ace, who had stopped in front of a body of an unknown man, his eyes darkening. Ace, Luffy said, his voice shaking. Bring Ace back to the present. He took a deep breath and stepped over the body, the brothers following right behind him. Well, what do we have here? Ace and Sabo turned around quickly, pushing Luffy behind them, their pipes now held up and ready to fight or defend if necessary. The bunch of brats, wonder what that old man's doing keeping children on his ship. Another man said, emerging from the shadows, his face bloody, but a slimy smile remained. Doesn't matter, there are tickets out of here. The first man said with a smile while Ace and Sabo grew closer together. We're not going anywhere. Ace said, sneering at the man, his eyes dark with rage. You're right, we only need 2 of you. The other man said, pulling out a gun, and before the boys could even blink, he shot Luffy right in the chest. Their eyes widened as Luffy flew back a few feet, his breath catching in his throat, and he fell to the deck. No sound, no tears, nothing. Luffy? They shouted at the not moving child, hoping he wasn't dead. It looks like you two will do. The first man said with a rough laugh as Sabo went running towards the man, his pipe drawn and his aim clear, only to be kicked in the head and knocked to the ground with a thud, blood trickling down his face now. Sabo? Ace shouted, making his own move now. Ace was able to fight the man and block better than Sabo did, but he was getting tired while the man was laughing. I can't hurt you too much, kid, you won't sell that well with your looks all dirty, he said, making Ace angrier. Like hell you're selling me. He shouted, swinging his pipe once more at the man. Oh. That hurt. Luffy had gotten up, the bullet bouncing off of him. You're alive. The second man said, walking slowly toward Luffy, who took notice of the danger he was in. But the Sabo? Ace, Luffy shouted, looking toward Sabo, who was starting to get back on his feet, but his knees were shaking. What a strange body you have there, kid, the man said, grabbing Luffy by the throat, lifting him in the air. Let me go. Help, Ace. Marco pops. Someone. He shouted loudly, hoping beyond hope someone would come for him. Luffy? Ace shouted again, turning towards his brother, which resulted in him being hit in the back, knocking the boy to the ground, having the wind knocked out of him. Ace was gasping for air on his hands and knees, and Sabo was ready for round 2, charging towards the man who had Luffy in his arms. "Stay down, brat," the man said, pulling his gun and shooting at Sabo, the blonde's eyes widening as the explosion from the gun brushed his face, the bullet missing his body, but the sparks flaring around him burning his skin. "HH." He shouted, falling to the ground beside Ace, holding his eyes as blood fell into his hands. "Sabo." Luffy cried out, tears pooling down his own face. "You could make us some good cash with that body of yours, kid, just think of all the fun things people could do to you." The second man said to Luffy, who was fighting as hard as he could. "Gomu Gomu no pistol." He shouted, pulling his arm back and shooting it out, but it wobbled and waved, missing his target altogether. The man grabbed the stretched arm, letting Luffy's throat go, and slammed him into the deck. "Luffy." Ace said, getting his voice back. He was fighting his own tears now as he looked towards Sabo, who was shaking and holding his face with his bloodied hand. "Sabo." He looked towards Luffy, who wasn't moving this time. "Help us, please." Ace said he was shaking but wouldn't give up without a fight. "We need to get out of here, the rest of the men are being owned by the effing commanders. Let's take the brats and go, the cash we get from them will resupply us with what we need." The second guy said as Ace got up and charged again. The men pushed him down and stomped on his head, holding him there. "Fine, I know a loss when I see one," the first man said, throwing Luffy over his shoulder and Ace into the other man's arms. "Should we take the blonde?" the second guy asked, but only got a shaking head in response. "He's ugly now. Take the hothead, he might make us some good cash if we break him right," he said with a smile. Line break. This battle had to be one of the worst a crew had ever seen, and that was saying something. Just where the hell did these bastards come from? Thatch asked, his katana drawn. They had been fighting for a long time, and clearly they were winning, but it was taking a toll on everyone. "No clue, wish they'd crawled back into whatever hole they crawled out from though, Yoi," Marco said, punching another down as Thatch cut another through. "I hope the brats are okay," Thatch said softly, looking for his next opponent. "They should be. We've been keeping the battle as far from their door as possible, Yoi," Marco said, helping another brother out, giving the man a reassuring nod. "They better be," Thatch said as they continued to push back the stupid crew who dared to attack them. "Help us, please." Thatch heard those words through the battle and turned towards the sound, his eyes wide. Marco turned in the same direction, blue flames licking his body as panic shot through his veins. "Shit." Thatch practically screamed, causing Pops to take notice of the panic in Marco's eyes. "What's happening, my sons?" he questioned, sending another man flying from the ship. The battle had been won by the right crew, and only the stragglers remained behind to fight the last bit. "I heard Ace. Something's happening," Thatch said, dashing towards the brat's room. Whitebeard was done with this fight. Using his ability, he blasted the last few remaining members off of his ship and moved with his family towards the kid's room, quickly, his heart racing. "Sabo." Marco kneeled down beside the boy who was lying on the ground, tears coming from one eye, his hand covering another, blood sticky on his face. "They're gone. I couldn't do anything. I'm such a failure," he screamed through his tears as Marco pulled the boy into his arms. "No, you're not, you're a warrior, Yoi," Marco said softly, his eyes turning towards the open sea. "We're the failures. We should have noticed you were in danger sooner." Thatch said he looked towards the ocean as well, hoping to see a ship, any ship that might lead them towards the brothers. "Luffy was shot," Sabo whispered from Marco's arms. Marco tensed up and the ship fell into a silent rage. "And what of Ace?" Pop said, getting down to Sabo's level. "He was knocked unconscious." The world began to spin for Sabo. His face hurt, his ribs hurt, everything on him seemed to hurt. "Please find them," he said before passing out. "Get him to the infirmary now, we have our brothers to chase after," Pops ordered, and the crew was beginning to move once again, anything to bring their family back home. "Luffy was shot, Yoi," Marco whispered as Sabo was removed from his arms and taken below deck. "We'll find the bastards that did it, Marco," Haruta said reassuringly, coming to stand by her brother. "Yes, we will, and when we do I will kill them, all of them, Yoi," he said, his eyes freezing, blue flames licking his skin as he stood up, turning himself into the phoenix he was and taking off into the air, a loud cry for vengeance left in his wake. "Come home safe, my sons." Marco flew for what felt like hours. His wings were sore and his lungs hurt from crying out his song for revenge. Marco hadn't rested after the fight on deck, so his body was protesting violently for him to stop his search and heal. He refused to give up though, and he would search this damned ocean for his brothers until he either found them or dropped dead from exhaustion. "Where are you, Yoi?" he said, trying to keep himself calm, but the longer he flew around aimlessly, the further away his little brothers were going. He couldn't, no, he wouldn't let Luffy vanish from his life like this. He loved Ace and could see them growing to be closer friends and brothers through the years, but he had spent what felt like a lifetime with Luffy. Closing his eyes, he truly let the fear of loss sink in. "Where in the world were you going, Lou?" Thatch asked the now happy baby that was cuddling close to Marco. "Ma," came from Luffy's mouth, making everyone stop what they were doing. "What was that, Yoi?" Marco asked the toddler. "Ma. Ma," he just said, looking up at Marco. The crew didn't know if they should break out laughing or celebrate their little brat's first word. "Look. Marco shall now be known as Mama Marco." Thatch laughed so hard he began to double over. Ignoring Thatch, Marco smiled fondly at the little guy. "Were you looking for me, Luffy Yoi?" he said. Luffy just responded with "Ma." Smiling at the memory, Marco's eyes snapped open, fierce determination, sparking the blue eyes, making them look more alert than they were supposed to. "I'll find you, Ace, I'll find you, Luffy, just as you have always found me, Yoi." And he flew off, determined to find his little brothers before the storm clouds came rolling in. Line break. "It's all my entire fault," Sabo whispered from the bed he was laying in. He now had a bandage covering half of his face over his eye. "No, it's not, you did your very best," Thatch said, sitting down on the bed beside the kid who refused to look at him. "I should have done more, I was careless and reckless, and Luffy and Ace were hurt because of that." Sabo felt like crying, and if he knew the tears wouldn't hurt his sore eye, he would have cried right there and then. "You're a child, it should have been us that protected you," Pop said, entering the room looking at the child and the injury on his face. "I've never needed protection before. I'm strong. I can fight on my own," Sabo said, punching the bed with his fist in frustration. "You are strong, but now you are one of us," Pop said, sitting in a chair beside the bed, looking the boy right in the good eye he had. "You no longer need to fight alone, you are now my son, and that means you will have the protection I can give you," he said, and Sabo felt the tears come, his sore eye stung just as he knew it would. "Please find them, I can't even think of living life without them," Sabo cried, his lip quivering and his body shaking. He felt like shit, he felt weak and vulnerable. Those were feelings he was taught never to feel and never to show, and here he was crying in front of the strongest man alive. "Neither can we, Marco will find them and we will move into action," Thatch said, giving Sabo's shoulder a reassuring squeeze. "You said they wanted to sell you?" Aizu said, leaning against a wall, his sharp eyes on the boy. "That man said he only needed 2 of us." Sabo tried to remember everything, but it all hurt too much. "We should send a group towards Sabaody just in case," Aizu said, turning towards his father, who thought about that option. "We're in the new world now, they will need to go through Fishman Island to get back to Sabaody," he said in thought. "Send Namor to get in contact with Jinbe. If anyone enters Fishman Island with the brats, they will know what to do." The older man's eyes darkened, promising pain and misery to those who hurt his sons. Sabo had given the description of the men to Pops and the others as best as he could, considering he had a concussion and his face had been burned pretty badly. This injury is going to scar, isn't it?" Sabo asked, putting his hand on the bandage, frowning. "Unfortunately, and you'll need to rest until your ribs are back to normal," the doctor said, coming to stand beside Thatch and Pops, giving him a check over once again. "If I'm hurt, what about Ace and Luffy?" he said, remembering once again of his failure to protect his brothers. "We will just have to make it up to them once we get them back." There wasn't a hint of doubt in Thatch's voice that he would be getting the brothers back home safe. "Luffy was shot, you said?" Aizu said from his spot, still watching the kid. But it bounced off of him. He had told them about Lou being shot, but not in full details yet. Once they brought Sabo below deck, he went into surgery on his eye. The doctor wanted to ensure that it could be saved before the crew bombarded him with questions. He deflected the bullet, but it still hurt him. He explained, and the others seemed to understand. "He's made of rubber now due to his devil fruit, that could be a benefit for him," Thatch said, putting his hand on his chin, thinking about it. "But it still hurt him, that's interesting to know," Aizu replied, and Pops shook his head. "We'll just have to ensure he never gets shot again." And that was finalized. "Get some rest, all of you, we'll need our strength when the time comes, and you, my son." Dottie stopped and looked toward Sabo. "We'll need to be strong enough to welcome your brothers home." Sabo smiled softly as the man stood up, leaving the kid to rest. Line break. Luffy began to open his eyes only to see the outside of a ship. Luffy Ace was chained up to the mast, Luffy right beside him. Where are we?" he asked, still dazed, his head hurt a whole lot. "We're prisoners," Ace said sadly. Luffy's eyes began to fill with tears. "Don't cry, Lou," he said, quickly trying to defuse that before anyone heard him cry. "I know you're scared, but we need to be brave. We need to show these people we are whitebeard pirates in the making," he said, hoping to give Luffy some sort of courage. "But I want to go home," he said softly. "I know, me too, I'm worried about Sabo, but Marco will come for us, the old man will come for us, so be strong, okay?" Ace said, hoping to calm him down some, and was glad to see it work. "So I gotta be strong like Marco?" Luffy whispered, and Ace smiled weakly towards him. "Amen, be strong like Marco and brave like Pops," Ace said, glad to have Luffy not crying. "Looks like the brats are awake," one of the men said. "A storm's coming, should we move them inside?" Another shouted, only to get a laugh in response. "Nah, let them sit, we just need them alive, not in perfect condition," the first man laughed, turning away from them. Ace glared at the crew, hoping to let them know once he was free from these stupid chains, there would be hell to pay. "Ace, we need to get these off of us," Luffy whispered, looking around for anything that might help. "Yeah, but we can't do that with these people watching us." He knew they were stuck as long as the pirates were watching them. "I'll distract them if we can find something to help us," Luffy said, looking around the ship once more, his eyes hardened with determination. "Wait, what? No. I'll distract them." Ace wasn't going to let Luffy do anything dangerous while he was there. "Ace, I'm not strong enough," Luffy said in a harsh whisper to his brother. Ace's eyes shook at that information. "I can't fight like you and Sabo can, I can't aim well, I can only cry. You said I need to be strong like Marco and brave like Pops, and that's what I'm doing," he said, looking into Ace's brown eyes, trying to show he could do this. "You are strong enough and smarter than me to get out of this problem. I can keep their eyes off of you once we know what to do," he continued, and Ace closed his eyes, trying to control his emotions. "You'll get hurt," his voice shook, but Luffy laughed quietly. "Just a bit, but I'm rubber." Luffy said that like it solved all of his problems. As often as they looked around, it seemed like nothing was available to get these stupid chains off of them. "I heard devil fruit users sell more," one of the members said, making the two boys freeze from their searching. "Yeah, the one brat might make us lots of cash with his fruit powers, even if they are pretty shitty," another said with a smile. "The other's kinda rough around the edges, I doubt anyone will buy him," the second guy said, frowning and looking towards Ace, who glared at the man with dark eyes. "Maybe we should give him a fruit to even the odds," another guy said, coming into the conversation. "Is it worth it though? The only fruit we have on deck is the Maramara no Mi, and I don't really feel like the kid should have the power to burn the ship down," the first guy countered, glaring right back at Ace. "We have sea stone cuffs below deck we can put on him to stunt the power, but if we don't do something we won't be able to sell that piece of shit kid," the third guy said, smiling at Ace with dirty teeth and dark eyes. "What are they talking about?" Luffy asked Ace, who was glaring as hard as he possibly could. "They don't think I'll sell," Ace replied with a small smile, knowing he wasn't going anywhere. "Of course you won't sell, we're going to go home," Luffy said, annoyed that the thought of them being sold crossed Ace's mind at all. "You're right, we just need to think faster, that's all." And the boys went back to their searching. "Ace, over there." Luffy nudged his brother towards a part of the ship where a small knife was laying on a table. "That's too far, they'll notice." Ace shook his head, but Luffy refused to give up. "We'll think of something, we need that knife," he said, but Ace knew Luffy was never good at thinking. "I'll do the thinking, you try and rest for now. Once I've come up with a plan we'll move into action," Ace said, looking towards the target. Luffy nodded his head in understanding. "Boy, brats," one man said. The two froze in a slight fear. Did they notice their plan already? "It's your lucky day, kid," one said to Ace, kneeling down. Ace had to hold himself still as the man's bad breath hit his face. "What, you're going to let us go?" he said sarcastically, making the man cuff him on the head. "Shut it, brat, we're giving up a piece of our treasure to ensure you make us some good cash," he said with a sneer. Pulling Ace's leg forward forcefully, he placed a cuff on his ankle. "If it's your treasure, then you guys really do suck." Ace scoffed at the man before he smiled up at Ace. "Eat," he said, placing a fruit in front of him. Ace's eyes widened. "The devil fruit," he whispered out. "Not just any devil fruit, one that will help us out. Now eat," he said again, and with shaking hands Ace picked up the fruit, staring at its red and orange swirls before taking a bite. Ace felt like throwing up once the taste hit his tongue, it was so disgusting. "Nothing happened," he said in worry once he finished eating the disgusting fruit, though his body felt unusually warm now. "Of course nothing happened, you really think we're going to let you burn the ship down? This here keeps you under our control," he said, pointing to the cuff. "You know what this is made of?" he asked them, and they shook their heads in confusion. "This is sea stone, the only thing that can keep fruit-using freaks like you under control. The only reason your little friend here doesn't have any on him is because his powers are so crappy he doesn't need it." He laughed out loud and walked away, pleased with himself. "I don't know what I ate, I don't know what I can do," Ace said quietly, and Luffy put his head on Ace's shoulder. "Don't worry so much, I have a plan," he whispered, and told Ace his plan to use his Gomu Gomu powers to grab the knife from the table and bring it back to them. "Even if I miss and it gets knocked down, at least it will be closer, I can do something from there, K," Luffy said while Ace digested the plan. "What do you plan to do?" he asked him quietly, and Luffy looked away. "Don't worry about it," was all he said, which only caused Ace to dread Luffy's idea more and more. "Are you ready, Ace?" he asked one last time, giving his brother a look, clearly saying this was going to happen whether he liked it or not. "Ready?" he said after a sigh of defeat. "Gomu gomu no." He started, then stretched his arm out towards the knife. He used the skills that Aizu had been working hard to teach him and aimed properly. He missed the knife just by a little as his hand shot over top of it, but he grabbed it quickly when his arm began to recoil back. "Gotcha," he whispered excitedly, bringing the knife back towards him and passing it to Ace. Ace looked at it with disbelief. Luffy had actually done it, he actually got the knife, they had a chance for freedom. "Ace, we were lucky they didn't see me do that, but we won't always be that lucky," he stated and looked towards the sky. "A storm's coming," Ace said, looking up as well, worry evident on his face. "I'll keep them busy, you need to get the chins off of yourself." "Luffy? Our chains aren't connected and they're probably not stupid enough to unlock both of us." He trailed off and looked at Ace as he put the pieces together. "If they remove yours then I'll only have to deal with mine," he all but whispered. "Man, and I can keep their eyes off of you and onto me," Luffy said, grinning his toothy grin. "Let me be strong like my family, K." Ace felt tears coming but swallowed the lump in his throat. "Be safe, little brother." Luffy nodded his head. "You too, big brother." Then Luffy opened his mouth and began to scream as loudly as he could, every curse word he had ever heard in his life and as many insults as he could. "Why, you damned brat. Shut your effing face," one man said and kicked Luffy in the head, but it bounced off. "Once my old man gets here he's gonna kick all your lame stupid asses," Luffy said, grinning the way Thatch had shown him how once. "Oh, is he?" another guy said. "Of course, you're all a bunch of weak losers who couldn't even stand up to my big brothers," he said, Ace's eyes widened a fracture on the way Luffy was holding himself. "You piece of shit," the guy said, kicking Luffy in the chest. "You're nothing but a bunch of baboons that can only cower and kidnap kids. Weaklings," Luffy shouted. "That's it, I've had enough, take this brat indoors and we'll show him just how weak we really are," he said with a grin, looking down at Luffy, who glared up at him. One of the men unlocked Luffy's chains and grabbed him by the hair, lifting him in the air. Luffy winced from the pain but looked down at Ace. "Luffy," he whispered when he saw the slight smile on his little brother's face, showing no fear. "What of the other one?" the guy said, who unlocked Luffy's chains. "Leave him, this one's pissed me off the most." He pointed his thumb towards Luffy as they carried him into the ship. "Please make it out of there alive," Ace whispered before getting to work with the knife, working to unlock the chains as fast as possible. "Ops, Marco, Thatch, someone please hurry." Thunder clasped the sky as the rain threatened to pour. A large storm was about to come through. That is the end, so thanks for watching. Comment down below with recommendations on what fanfic I should do next. And remember to like and subscribe to my channel.